February 20th, 2016. It's a chilly Saturday morning in the quiet community of West Haven, Connecticut.
West Haven, just outside of New Haven. It's more of the suburban area in New Haven.
Typically, it's a very friendly and pretty safe community.
But this isn't a typical Saturday morning. It's a little before 7:30 when Patricia Folsom arrives outside the apartment complex where her adopted daughter, 26-year-old Kenita Nicholas, lives.
She used to babysit for her, so that morning she was going there to get the baby from her so she could go to work.
The normal routine would be that she would pull up into the apartment complex, beat the horn, and Kenita would bring the baby out to her.
I was just outside, just beeping, 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 and then, calling her.
But Kenita doesn't answer.
Hey, it's Kenita. Leave a message.
Kenita, where are you? I'm outside.
Several minutes pass with no sign of Kenita and the baby. Concerned, Patricia gets out of her car and goes to the door.
Kenita, are you in there?
Once again, there's no answer. But what Patricia does here sends her into a panic.
I'm banging on the door, trying to get in, and I just hear the baby screaming, crying.
Kenita, are you okay?
The mother was rightly concerned. Her daughter was supposed to be there to let her in.
My heart, honestly, I thought maybe she slipped in the tub and got hurt.
With no key to open the door and fearing that something has happened to her daughter, Patricia calls 911.
West Haven Fire was the first to get there.
Please get my baby.
Fearing that the baby was in danger, they decided that they would breach the door.
As firemen enter the apartment, Patricia follows close behind, and what she sees is far worse than anything she could have imagined.
I kind of pushed up in there, and I kind of seen the scene.
No, not my baby. Kenita, no.
26-year-old Kenita Nicholas had a vibrant energy that brought joy to everyone she met.
She's very silly and just spontaneous and spunky. She's been the same way her whole life.
She was goofy. She always jump around, joke around.
She would give off this aura about her, like she had no worries in the world.
However, Kenita's loving nature stemmed from a troubled childhood.
She had suffered quite a bit of abuse and neglect as a child. She'd been shuffled from home to home, living with various relatives.
At one point in time, Kenita lived with me and my grandmother for a while.
It was only when she was in high school that Kenita had found a permanent home with Patricia Folsom.
I knew that she needed somebody to love her, and so I went and got custody of her. And she became my daughter.
She was very close and trusted her. She looked at her as a mom.
We just got closer and closer, and she was my heart. I loved her. She's the daughter I never had.
Patricia and Kenita remained close, even after Kenita moved to the Hartford area for college.
She went to Central State University, wanted to be a social worker.
During her freshman year at Central State, Kenita met an aspiring musician named Antonio Chambly.
He was working at the campus radio station at the time, doing a promotion. She walked by, and he struck up a conversation with her.
Hey, how you doing? How you doing? Hey, we're doing a show this weekend. You should come.
Cool.
The chance encounter soon turned into a relationship.
I think they just clicked and connected.
Things seemed really great between them. They had a lot of fun together.
However, a year into the relationship, their lives suddenly changed.
I remember her telling me that she was pregnant with her daughter.
They loved each other, and now they were expecting a child. So they decided to get a place together so they could raise the baby.
Kenita dropped out of school and in 2011 gave birth to a baby girl.
She was a great mom. That was one of the things that made her happy, just being able to be responsible for her life.
She did everything she was supposed to as a mom and really embraced the role of motherhood.
But before their daughter's second birthday, Kenita and Antonio called it quits.
She left him. but she never really stated why. She wasn't one to like tell all her personal business.
She wanted to move back to New Haven where her family was. So that's what she did.
At the time in her life, I don't guess it just wasn't meant to be.
Needing the support of her family, Kenita and her daughter moved back in with Patricia.
They lived with her mother temporarily. Then Kenita took a housekeeping job at a local hotel.
She was like, I'm working my butt off, but at least it's gonna pay some money enough for me to like get my own place.
She found an apartment. She was so happy. It was like a exciting thrill for her.
That was her first apartment that she ever had on her own. And she was very proud of it. She was like, whew, my daughter got her own room.
She wanted to give her child a better life than she had.
And that's what she was doing, and fixing up her little apartment for her and her daughter.
Between the new apartment, work, and her daughter, Kenita stayed busy, but still found time to hang out with her friends, too.
She worked her job and did what she had to do so she could have fun, too.
But she wasn't looking for a relationship. Didn't seem like she was interested in anybody.
Then, in June of 2014, Kenita met 35-year-old Gerard Crosley, and that all changed.
Her best friend was Gerard's cousin, and she introduced her to him.
I can't believe we've never met before.
I know, right?
He was kind of quiet and a sweet guy.
Gerard wasted no time asking Kenita out, and their relationship quickly blossomed.
Oh, hey, baby.
He was really in love with her and used to get her roses and flowers and things like that.
Oh, they're beautiful.
You like 'em?
Thank you. Yes.
She was really digging him. She just felt like loved and appreciated.
The couple continued to grow closer and took steps to be together as often as they could.
He eventually moved in with her. She got him a job where she works.
In the fall of 2014, the couple took the next step when Kenita became pregnant.
She was like, I'm having a boy. She always wanted a boy.
With the birth of their son in June of 2015, it looked as if Gerard and Kenita were ready to solidify their family.
She said, we are going to get married.
She was thinking long-term with him. She was really in love.
But soon, a tragedy would darken the bright future the couple envisioned. On February 20th, 2016, West Haven first responders have just found Kenita bloody and unresponsive on her apartment floor.
Not my baby. Kenita, no.
They started pushing me out so that I wouldn't see no more. And I'm like, well, give me the baby. Give me the baby.
Give me my baby. Give me my baby.
The 7-month-old child was present in that room.
I just left with the baby, trying not to think about what was going on.
Outside, paramedics work to determine if there are any injuries to the infant.
His clothes was all bloody, but he was fine. There was nothing wrong with him.
Sadly, the same cannot be said for Kenita.
I said, how is she? And the guy just like shook his head. No.
Is she okay?
Sorry, man.
The news of Kenita's death leaves her family grasping for answers.
Who would kill Kenita?
It's completely senseless.
For Kenita Nicholas and Gerard Crosley, there appeared to be no limits to their love.
She was in love with him, and she just wanted to be a family with her 2 kids and him and her, and just be happy.
But on the morning of February 20th, 2016, West Haven, Connecticut firefighters have just found Kenita dead inside the couple's apartment.
That was absolutely brutal. See, there was blood everywhere.
Even at first glance, it was obvious she had been murdered.
Her throat had been cut, and she also had wounds to her upper torso area and to her arms, indicating some sort of a fight.
When detectives arrive on the scene, they immediately treat it as a homicide.
It was a pretty violent struggle that moved throughout that apartment, throughout that immediate living room where the deceased was located.
While they are able to piece together how the crime may have unfolded, the motive is not clear.
It did not appear that this was a robbery.
There was no signs of forced entry. There was nothing stolen.
In fact, the only thing missing appears to be the murder weapon.
In the kitchen, the police found that the drawer had been opened where knives were kept, so that led them to conclude that it was possible that the knife that had been used to murder her had been taken from that drawer.
Who had wielded that knife? The blood on the walls may contain a clue.
It's common that in stabbings of this type, the suspect could become injured.
There could very well be a mix of the assailant's blood with Kenita's. This would definitively link the person to the crime.
Thank you.
While crime scene technicians collect blood samples, detectives start speaking to neighbors who have gathered outside.
We spoke to the neighbors, and all of them said that they heard some type of arguing and what they described as loud bangs coming from the apartment sometime between 7 o'clock and 7:20 in the morning.
Then there was no more arguing and only a baby crying.
One neighbor also reports seeing a possible suspect fleeing the area.
She saw someone dressed in a dark-colored gray and black hoodie sweatshirt, like a fleece-style sweatshirt, walking through the back of the apartment complex.
The witness didn't know the person, but told police they were walking away from the scene at around 7:30, just moments after Kenita's mom arrived.
Police started to canvass that particular neighborhood in order to see if they could find any surveillance footage, which would help them identify who this individual was.
While patrol officers search for cameras, detectives turn to Kenita's adoptive mother, Patricia Folson.
Excuse me, ma'am. Do you mind if we ask you a few questions?
Patricia had been waiting in the ambulance with her daughter's 7-month-old.
The fact that the baby was there when she was killed horrified me. That absolutely stood out to me.
You can have your grandson back in a moment. Ma'am, we just need you to answer a few questions.
I'll try.
She was still in shock. I mean, she had just talked to her daughter, and now she's found dead in her apartment.
You spoke to Kenita this morning?
Yeah, it was around 7.
She had talked to Kenita about picking up the 7-month-old baby so that Kenita could go to work that day.
Patricia was already keeping Kenita's 5-year-old daughter, whom she left at home that morning with her adult son while she went to get the baby.
She was gonna go over, and she was gonna give Kenita a ride to work, come back, watch the kids.
Based on when Patricia last spoke to Kenita and when she arrived, detectives come to a terrifying conclusion.
We believe that Patricia Folsom had arrived at the apartment while the suspect was still inside.
Do you have any idea who may have been inside the apartment with Kenita this morning?
Gerard was supposed to be at work.
Gerard, Kenita's boyfriend, was already at work.
He worked in the kitchen, like breakfast stuff, because he used to go early in the morning, like before 5.
She didn't say anything about Antonio coming by.
Antonio?
Yeah, Kenita's ex, her daughter's father.
Patricia Folsom was able to provide information regarding the older child's father.
Patricia said she thought that they got along well, but Kenita was pretty private about her relationships. So if something was wrong, she probably wouldn't have mentioned it.
She kept me out of that. I don't know. They seemed like they were good.
Any custody issues?
Not until Gerard came in the picture.
Antonio didn't like the idea of Gerard being there around his child and potentially trying to raise his child.
To detectives, it was possible Antonio confronted Kenita and an argument ensued. It definitely seemed like a crime of passion.
Based on the amount of injuries to Kenita Nicholas's body, it appeared to us that this was some type of a rage incident.
However, just as detectives are realizing they need to talk to Antonio, Patricia raises another possibility.
That was Danielle, too. Her and Kenita didn't get along.
Whoa. Who's Danielle?
Gerard's ex.
Patricia tells detectives that Gerard has a lot of history with this woman. He fathered children with her.
According to Patricia, Kenita tried to get along with Danielle for the sake of the children, but to no avail.
She was jealous of the relationship that Kenita was having with Gerard.
She would say she was having problems with the other parent.
Were there fights between the women?
No, mainly arguing.
So nothing physical.
Not from what I know.
Everybody was kind of, a little grouchy about how they wanted to work out situations with each other. I was just like, just try to be nice. Kenita wasn't that type.
But now that Kenita had been found dead, detectives wondered if the tension between the two women had turned violent.
You need to find Gerard. Find out what he knows.
There's always a chance when someone's fighting. You're fighting with someone that you could really end up like that.
According to FBI statistics, guns are the most common weapon used to commit homicide. The odds of being murdered by a firearm are nearly 7 times higher than the odds of being murdered by a knife. In 2016, 73% of U.S. murders were committed with a firearm, while only a little more than 10% were committed with a knife or sharp object. Detectives investigating the murder of Kenita Nicholas have just learned of tensions between the 26-year-old mother of 2 and a woman named Danielle Hall.
Kenita's boyfriend, Gerard Crossley, had previously dated Danielle, and they had children together.
Kenita had been reaching out to Gerard's kids, trying to make them feel welcome in his new family.
She tried to have them come over, but the other parent had issues with that. It just wasn't working.
Is it possible Danielle had something to do with Kenita's death? When detectives bring her in for questioning, she appears shocked by the news.
When did this happen?
This morning.
When detectives pressed Danielle about what Kenita's mom told them, she admitted that her and Kenita were hardly friends.
However, Danielle swears that she had nothing to do with Kenita's murder.
Where were you at 7:30 this morning?
I was still at work.
Danielle told detectives she worked third shift and didn't get off until 8:30 a.m.
Detectives will have to confirm Danielle's alibi. But before they do, she suggests perhaps Gerard may be a victim as well.
Is Gerard okay?
We're still trying to get in touch with him.
Look, just so you know, he's been mixed up with some pretty bad people in the past.
She told us that he was pretty well known in the drug trade, both seller and consumer of narcotics.
The people he used to run with, they scared me. Maybe this has something to do with them.
After talking to Danielle, detectives pulled Gerard's rap sheet.
He had a pretty serious criminal record. He had been arrested for some drug offenses.
Police started to wonder, was this crime the result of money that Gerard owed to somebody else that he hadn't paid that now fell on Kenita?
So it was imperative that we found him not only to interview him about what he knew, but to make sure that he's not injured or a victim himself.
Detectives contact the hotel where he works and make an alarming discovery.
He didn't show up to work that morning.
Next, detectives make several calls to Gerard's cell phone, but they all go unanswered.
They started to wonder if Gerard was actually murdered somewhere as a result of this, or he's on the run from whoever may be hunting him.
Though detectives are unable to reach Gerard, they are able to find Kenita's ex, Antonio Chambly.
He was obviously somebody we wanted to talk to and find out what he knew about the crime.
Once contacted by detectives, Antonio makes the 45-minute drive from Hartford to West Haven.
I want to thank you for coming in here to speak with us today.
Sure. I still can't believe this.
He seemed pretty shaken up about it.
He was looking for information about what happened and was just concerned for the welfare of his own child.
I don't know what I'm gonna tell her.
Your daughter?
Yeah.
You and Kenita shared custody, right?
Well, not officially. We never went to court or anything.
When they split, they had split custody of her. So he would have her half of the time and she would have her half of the time. Well, it wasn't like a court order or something like that.
So you got along?
Yeah, probably better than when we were together.
They always remained friends and was very cordial and co-parenting together.
And her being with Gerard, that didn't bother you?
No, she's free to see who she wants.
Okay.
Antonio tells detectives he had no real issues with Gerard either. He was just initially cautious of another man helping to raise his child.
You know, he never liked him for his daughter.
So what was the problem?
It was kind of weird, having my daughter around some strange man. But Kenita, she told me to stay in my own lane. So I did.
So he was accepting to it.
Based on his genuine concern for both his child and Kenita, detectives believe Antonio is innocent.
It seemed like he had a pretty good relationship with her.
We're not enemies. We're not constantly bickering. We're not arguing. So it was kind of weird for some people to accept that we were just real good friends.
At this time, we did not believe that he was involved in any way.
I'm just in a place where it's like, wow, I just lost one of my best friends. Thank you, God. My daughter wasn't there to see it.
Detectives can't rule out the possibility that someone close to Kenita had killed her, though. And when they receive both the autopsy and blood analysis, they hope to have a new lead.
The forensic report was that Kenita Nicholas received numerous stab wounds, as well as a significant laceration to her neck and throat area.
Kenita was stabbed 30 times.
A stabbing like that, that's personal in nature.
It just screams it's a crime of passion.
However, the lab results on the blood found in Kenita's apartment don't yield the leads police were hoping for.
According to the lab results, it was only Kenita's blood on the wall.
Detectives are disappointed, but will soon learn that Antonio and Gerard aren't the only romantic links in Kenita's life.
We were contacted by an individual who was now in a new dating relationship with Kenita Nicholas.
It was a romantic relationship. They were romantically involved.
Detectives are shocked by the caller's claim, but even more so by their name.
The caller identified herself as Melissa Kelly.
Please find out that Kenita was in a new relationship with another woman.
Detectives were under the impression that Kenita was only currently involved with Gerard. So this information brought a new motive into the mix.
They were convinced that this relationship must have had something to do with Kenita's murder.
Less than 24 hours into the murder investigation of Kenita Nicholas, a witness comes forward to West Haven police with surprising information.
Gerard and Kenita had broken up, and Kenita had started this new relationship with a woman by the name of Melissa.
She'd learned about what happened to Kenita and contacted the West Haven Police Department and advised that she'd had some information about what had occurred.
Detectives immediately arranged for 28-year-old Melissa Kelly to come down to the station for a statement.
So how many people knew about the two of you?
I don't know. I thought we were a secret. She was supposed to tell her mom soon.
Kenita's mother didn't tell detectives about the new girlfriend because she didn't know.
She kept it quiet from me because it was a relationship that I would not have agreed with.
How long did you know Kenita?
We had been friends for a while.
It's been like over a year that they knew each other.
But they had only been dating for a few weeks now.
I just can't believe that she's gone.
She told the police she was looking forward to seeing this relationship grow and blossom.
Kenita deserved a little bit of happiness, especially after all that Gerard would do to her.
What do you mean?
He would hit her.
Kenita had indicated to her that there was a lot of domestic violence, that he had previously struck her and abused her in the past.
According to Melissa, the abuse was so severe, Kenita would call out of work.
Did she ever file a report?
No. She came to me about it, though, for advice.
She said he was on drugs and he was doing things to my cousin, you know, putting his hands on her.
Melissa tells detectives that with her encouragement, Kenita had broken things off with Gerard.
She said, enough is enough. I don't want to be with you no more. I'm not happy. This is not working. This is not good for my kids.
According to Melissa, her relationship with Kenita began to gain momentum after the split with Gerard.
They started hanging out more because that's who Kenita felt safe with, and she trusted this person.
Thank you.
For what?
Being here for me.
It was a new chapter. She was trying to find happiness.
However, according to Melissa, even as their romance grew more heated, Gerard was still in the picture.
Kenita kept the severity of the abuse from her family. Gerard would cool off and things would be fine, so she let him stay at the house to be close to their son.
She let him keep a key to her house and to come in to see her son whenever he wanted to.
Melissa says, even though Kenita ended the romantic relationship with Gerard, he was not letting go.
He was still trying. He thought that he could get back with her.
Did he know about you and Kenita?
Yeah, she told him.
According to Melissa, when Kenita finally told Gerard the truth about their relationship, he didn't take it well.
It wasn't like Kenita was leaving him for another man. She was leaving him for another woman. So pride becomes a factor, ego becomes a factor, and just a general challenge to his manhood.
According to Melissa, Gerard was a powder keg waiting to explode, and all he needed was the right spark.
When was the last time you saw Kenita?
She was at my apartment last night.
Where was the baby?
She brought him with her. She didn't trust Gerard alone with the baby.
Melissa claims Kenita returned home around 11 p.m. and called her shortly after.
When Kenita got home, they spoke on the phone, and Kenita told her that Gerard was upset that she was out late.
You need to hang up that phone.
Gerard was not happy with her and Kenita's relationship. He was upset that they were spending time together.
Melissa tells police that during their conversation, she could hear Gerard in the background.
He was like yelling and screaming.
So why didn't you call the police?
She said she had it under control, but I know that Gerard did this to her. I know that he did this.
She wanted to make sure that if it was Mr. Crosley, that he was apprehended quickly.
However, there is one aspect to Melissa's story detectives find troubling.
Melissa's story is the first they've heard about Gerard being abusive.
I really didn't think that he would do that. He really didn't seem like he had that kind of temper.
Nobody in our family knew that she was going through any of that stuff.
Detectives had to consider the possibility that Melissa was not being truthful.
Could Melissa be pointing the finger at Gerard to cover her tracks?
Kenita Nicholas's lover, Melissa Kelly, has just leveled a stunning accusation against Kenita's ex-boyfriend, Gerard Crosley.
Melissa told detectives that Gerard had been abusing Kenita.
Melissa also gives detectives new information about the night before Kenita's murder.
She was able to tell us that she and Kenita had spent the evening together the previous night. Kenita takes a cab home about 11 o'clock. She gets home and Gerard's pissed, angry that she was out with her and that there was fighting throughout the night.
Where they been all night?
However, detectives aren't sure Melissa's telling the truth.
When Kenita's mom spoke to detectives, she didn't say anything about Gerard being abusive.
He's a very quiet person. No way do you see that he had a temper.
And you didn't go over there? Call 911? Anything?
She said that she had it under control.
She's a grown woman. She'll call me if she needs me. That was the kind of attitude she had.
It was enough to raise red flags with detectives.
They begin to wonder whether or not Melissa and Kenita could be possibly fighting about Gerard.
And it didn't bother you? Gerard still hanging around?
Like I said, I was worried.
But you weren't jealous.
Jealous of what? I was with Kenita, not Gerard.
Still unsure of Melissa's story, detectives let her go and figure there's at least one person still out there who knows the truth. Gerard.
Knowing that he might have been either involved or a witness, we made it a priority to find out where he was.
But it's not until the afternoon of the 23rd, almost 72 hours after the murder, that detectives get their first potential lead on Gerard's whereabouts.
We were able to develop information that he had some family in New Haven, and we were able to locate Gerard Crossley's sister.
Ma'am, we're with the West Haven Homicide Unit.
Is this about Kenita?
She indicated that she had spoke to Gerard.
And when was that?
Saturday morning, a little before 8 a.m.
Gerard had contacted her requesting to borrow some money. She also indicated that he didn't seem like himself. He seemed a little off, was what she told us.
Hey, sis, what's up?
You okay?
What? Yeah.
And how's that baby doing?
Baby? Oh, yeah, the baby. Yeah, he's fine.
You sure you're all right?
Gerard told her that him and Kenita had an argument, had a fight.
No.
She kick you out?
I just can't go back.
According to his sister, she didn't learn that Kenita had been murdered until later that afternoon.
She's on somebody's Facebook page that she was dead.
And you didn't have any idea before that?
Well, I knew he was acting strange, but I never suspected anything like that.
When we talked to Gerard's sister, I kind of got the feeling that she was loyal to her brother, and she was kind of torn.
In light of this new information, Gerard is now at the top of the suspect list.
He's not injured. He's not a victim in this situation. And the gears kind of switched to he becomes a person of interest at this point.
Where can we find him?
Maybe my cousin's. He stays there sometimes.
Detectives reach out to Gerard's cousin and receive some unexpected news.
We spoke to the cousin who told us that Gerard was at their apartment. He's ready to turn himself in.
Detectives immediately descend on the apartment and apprehend Gerard Crossley.
Get on the ground! Gerard didn't resist and surrendered to the detectives.
Gerard Crossley, you're under arrest for the murder of Kenita Nicholas.
He goes quietly, and he indicates to us that he's willing to talk about what had happened.
And then what happened is it takes another shocking twist. And this one is one that police can't even believe.
When I found out he was arrested, they had it on the news and I read it, I just was disgusted. So I was really just like, I still just wanted a reason. That's not going to make my family feel any better or bring her back. But still, when somebody do something, sometimes you just want to know, like, why? And I don't think we will ever get that answer.
On February 23rd, 2016, detectives in West Haven, Connecticut have just arrested 37-year-old Gerard Crossley for the murder of his ex-girlfriend, Kenita Nicholas.
There's a sense of relief. There's a sense that Kenita's gonna get a little bit of justice here. We know we have our man.
Kenita's new girlfriend told detectives that she overheard Kenita and Gerard arguing the night before the murder. And Gerard's sister admitted that he sounded very strange over the phone shortly after the murder occurred.
However, back at the station where Gerard is questioned by detectives, he swears they have made a horrible mistake.
Look, I don't know what happened to Kenita. You killed her, Gerard. No, man, you got it all wrong.
We interviewed him for 6 hours, and it was the same thing over and over again. I didn't do it. We know you did it. I wasn't there. We know you were there.
Eventually, after several grueling hours, detectives succeed in wearing Gerard down.
We were running on fumes at this time.
All right.
I was there, but I don't know what happened.
Gerard claims that on the night of February 19th, when Kenita returned home late, he was high on drugs and angry.
He was supposed to be on drugs. He was like on PCP.
He admits to having a verbal argument with her, and he was upset that she was out, upset that she was dating a woman.
I don't like you messing with that female. You
Just
know
go
that.
to bed, Gerard. Gerard, I'm not doing this like that. I'm not doing it.
So you spent the night?
Yeah.
But Gerard says that when he woke up in the morning, the argument picked up where it left off.
He admits to physically assaulting her, that he had thrown Kenita across the room and struck her numerous times.
So when did you get the knife?
I don't know.
He indicated to us that he had blacked out.
Gerard claimed he was still high from the night before.
Could he have blacked out? Possibly. But I just don't believe he wanted to admit to himself what he did.
Most people don't want to admit to anything that they've done bad. Never mind something as heinous as killing the mother of your child.
Oh, man. Remember these pictures?
To refresh his memory, detectives confront Gerard with the autopsy results.
She was stabbed 30 times, Gerard. Come on.
We're trying to get him to just come around and tell us to take responsibility for it. He just won't. But his details were very clear leading up to it and very clear afterwards.
Slowly, Gerard begins to confess to the murder of Kenita Nicholas.
He told us that he, Kenita, and the 7-month-old child were the only people that were in the apartment at this time.
Gerard says it all stemmed from Kenita being unwilling to reconcile their breakup.
He didn't want to break up. He didn't want to be away from her. So that was a problem.
The argument started again, and then it just got out of hand.
He obtained a knife from the kitchen. He used that knife to stab her and slit her throat.
If he couldn't have her, then nobody would.
Then he admitted to cleaning himself up and leaving.
When Gerard finishes making his statement, detectives book him on first-degree murder and then inform Kenita's family that her killer is in custody.
My heart dropped. It was very hard to think about.
Like, wow, is this reality? I was hurt. I just can't believe that he actually took her life.
How you do that in front of your kid? To his mom?
Gerard's arrest is made even more shocking by the revelation that he'd been abusing Kenita all along.
None of us in our family knew that she was going through this.
I just didn't see it.
If I knew the seriousness of it, I would have done something to try to help.
As the case moves toward trial, all Kenita's family can do is pray for justice.
You should never see the day of light again. You should be punished.
But in the end, Gerard never goes to trial.
Gerard's attorneys approached prosecutors looking to cut a plea deal.
If he had chosen to go to trial, the minimum he would have been looking at is 60 years for murder. But at that point, it became, you want to roll the dice, or would you rather plead to something less?
In March of 2017, Gerard pleads guilty to murder. In exchange for his plea, Gerard is sentenced to 35 years in prison.
He'll be 72 years old by the time he gets out.
It's extremely satisfying to know that not only does Kenita Nicholas's family get some justice, Gerard will not be able to hurt anybody else.
Will that ever be enough to make up for what Gerard took from those who loved Kenita?
I wish she had gave him more. I wanted to have life.
I just wish that she was here with me.
I miss her, man. I miss her.
She will be missed forever.
In their grief, Kenita's family also hopes her story could save someone else from suffering the same fate.
My baby didn't think he would go that far, but it did. That first shove, that's time to break it off. go find family, go find friends, get away from that person. It's not worth your family losing you. It's not worth you losing your life.
On a humid August night in 2001, as Argentina trembled on the brink of economic collapse, a single gunshot cracked through the narrow streets of a quiet Buenos Aires neighborhood, and by dawn a respected accountant named Martin Ferreira lay dead on his kitchen floor, the back door ajar, a cup of coffee still warm on the table, and the nation would soon learn the phrase that refused to fade from headlines. Buenos Aires 2001 cold case, mysterious killing, community shock. Ferreira was 43, meticulous, disciplined, the kind of man who balanced every ledger to the cent and locked every window twice before bed. He lived alone in a modest townhouse in Caballito, a district known more for family barbecues and corner bakeries than for violence. Neighbors described him as polite but reserved, a man who left for work at exactly 8 each morning and returned before sunset. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked drawers, no obvious robbery. Just one bullet, fired at close range, and a silence that spread like smoke through the building stairwell when a neighbor discovered his body after noticing newspapers piling up outside his door. Police arrived to flashing lights and murmuring crowds. Detectives quickly labeled it suspicious, calculated, personal. The back door showed no damage. The lock worked perfectly. Inside, investigators found a single wine glass beside the coffee cup, wiped clean. No fingerprints on the weapon because there was no weapon. It had vanished. A strange clue surfaced almost immediately, a faint trace of expensive cologne lingering in the air, unfamiliar to friends who insisted Ferreira never wore any fragrance at all. Cold case whispers began even before the funeral flowers wilted. Argentina in 2001 was unraveling. Banks were freezing accounts, protests were swelling in the plazas, and public trust in institutions was cracking. In that chaos, the murder of a quiet accountant might have slipped into obscurity, but something about the precision of the act kept reporters circling. Headlines screamed execution style, inside job, financial secret. Detectives dug into Ferreira's professional life and uncovered a list of high-profile clients, including construction magnates and mid-level politicians navigating the storm of corruption allegations that haunted the era. The theory of a silencing took shape quickly. Yet weeks turned into months without arrests. Witnesses were scarce. One elderly neighbor claimed she heard raised voices earlier that evening, a man and a woman arguing softly, but she could not identify them. Another resident remembered seeing a dark sedan idling near the curb around midnight, engine running, lights off. No license plate captured, no security cameras in those pre-smartphone days. The investigation stalled. Evidence collected from the scene produced no matches in national databases. The cologne trace was catalogued, bagged, forgotten. By 2003, the file had thickened, but the leads had thinned. Detectives interviewed former colleagues who described Ferreira as honest to a fault, sometimes stubborn when pressured to overlook discrepancies. A junior associate admitted that days before his death, Ferreira had confided he was reviewing irregular transfers tied to a municipal housing project. Millions of pesos had shifted through shell accounts. He planned to confront someone the following week. That week never came. The case edged toward the cold shelf, another unsolved tragedy in a country overwhelmed by crisis. The family refused to let it fade. Ferreira's younger sister, Lucia, appeared on late-night talk shows, clutching photographs and demanding justice. She repeated the same chilling detail. Her brother had called her the evening he died and said, "If anything happens, look at the contracts in the blue folder." Police searched his office again and found the folder empty, its contents missing. Mysterious disappearance of documents, potential motive, public outrage. The headlines kept the story alive, but without tangible proof, prosecutors hesitated to accuse anyone powerful. Years passed. Detectives retired. New administrations came and went. The townhouse was sold. Children who once whispered about the murder in schoolyards grew into adults who barely remembered the name. Officially, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case remained open but inactive, a dormant volcano in the archives. Then in 2019, nearly 2 decades later, A routine audit of preserved evidence changed everything. Advances in forensic chemistry allowed technicians to re-examine trace materials once considered useless. Among them, a tiny fiber lifted from the kitchen chair and a microscopic residue sample from the wine glass. The fiber, once dismissed as common upholstery, revealed a rare synthetic blend manufactured in limited quantities in Europe during the late 1990s. Import records showed only a handful of shipments into Argentina. One buyer stood out, a luxury car dealership owned by businessman Esteban Lujan, a former client of Ferreira who had publicly mourned him at the funeral. Investigators felt the old file crack open. They revisited financial records and discovered that Lujan's company had been entangled in the very housing project Ferreira was auditing. Strange clue, hidden connection, forgotten name resurfacing. When detectives obtained a warrant to compare DNA from the preserved wine glass residue with modern databases, they uncovered a partial profile. It did not match Lujan, but it matched someone closer, his former personal assistant, Carolina Vega, who had vanished from public life in 2002 and relocated to Spain. Vega had testified years earlier that she barely knew Ferreira. Now her genetic trace placed her at his kitchen table on the night he died. The shock rippled through newsrooms. Buenos Aires 2001 cold case aclarado, unexpected twist. Extradition proceedings began quietly. Spanish authorities detained Vega in a coastal town where she had built a new identity as a small business owner. Under questioning, she denied everything, insisting she had once attended a dinner meeting with Ferreira at Lujan's request but left early. Investigators confronted her with phone records recovered from archived billing systems showing multiple late-night calls between her and Ferreira in the weeks before the murder. The pattern suggested secrecy, urgency, perhaps an affair, perhaps something darker. Back in Argentina, prosecutors reopened the case publicly. Cameras crowded courthouse steps as aging detectives described the original scene with renewed intensity. They revealed another detail long withheld. The bullet recovered from the wall matched a handgun registered to a private security firm contracted by Lujan's dealership, though the weapon itself had never been found. Community shock surged anew. Memories reawakened. Lucia Ferreira stood before microphones with tears in her eyes, whispering that her brother had trusted the wrong people. Under mounting evidence, Vega's story shifted. She admitted she had been present the night of the killing but claimed Lujan pulled the trigger. According to her statement, Ferreira had demanded payment in exchange for silence about the housing project fraud. An argument erupted. Lujan allegedly carried the handgun for protection amid the unrest of 2001. In a flash of panic, she said he fired. They staged the scene to resemble a targeted hit, wiped surfaces, removed the blue folder, and drove away in the dark sedan remembered by the neighbor. Lujan was arrested at his estate outside the city in a dawn operation broadcast live across the country. The image of the once untouchable businessman in handcuffs ignited a firestorm. He denied all accusations, branding Vega a liar seeking leniency. His lawyers attacked the integrity of decades-old evidence and questioned the chain of custody. The courtroom became a battlefield of past and present colliding, of technological progress breathing life into forgotten fragments. A cold case solved, defense challenges mount, nation divided. As the trial unfolded, experts testified about the fiber, the DNA, the ballistic match. Financial analysts reconstructed the housing project scheme, tracing funds through ghost companies into offshore accounts linked to Lujan. Jurors listened to recordings of Ferreira's final voicemail to his sister, his voice calm but tense, promising to explain everything soon. The weight of 20 years pressed against the walls of the courtroom. Outside, crowds gathered nightly, holding candles and chanting for justice. In the end, it was Vega's detailed confession, corroborated by forensic evidence, that sealed the verdict. The jury found Lujan guilty of homicide and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Vega received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. When the judge read the decision, a hush fell, followed by a wave of applause that echoed down the courthouse corridors. Buenos Aires 2001 cold case aclarado, Arresto Inesperado Secured al País became more than a headline. It became a reckoning. Yet even as the nation absorbed the outcome, a lingering unease remained. Ferreira had been killed in a moment of fear and greed, silenced because he refused to compromise his principles. For 20 years his name had hovered like a ghost over a city accustomed to unfinished stories. The resolution brought relief, but also a stark reminder of how easily truth can be buried beneath power and chaos. In Caballito, neighbors still recall the humid night and the single gunshot that shattered their sense of safety. The townhouse stands renovated now, its walls repainted, its floors polished, but beneath the fresh surfaces lies the memory of a man who balanced numbers and believed integrity would protect him. The case is closed on paper, the arrests made, the verdict delivered, yet the echo of that shot continues to reverberate through Buenos Aires, a warning that even in the darkest crises, evidence waits patiently, and justice, though delayed, can return with a force powerful enough to shake an entire country. The verdict did not end the story. It reopened wounds that had been stitched shut by time and forced a city to confront the uneasy truth that the killer had never been a phantom slipping through Madrid's night, but a neighbor sharing the same staircase, the same elevator, the same thin walls. In the days after the conviction, newspapers ran relentless headlines: cold case closed, forgotten DNA, justice after 25 years, and yet beneath the triumphant tone lay a deeper question that echoed through cafes and office corridors. How many other silent traces were still waiting in forgotten boxes? How many other killers were walking calmly beneath the same sun? Laura Gomez's parents stood outside the courthouse surrounded by cameras, their faces lined not only by age, but by a quarter-century of suspended grief. They spoke softly about patience, about faith in science, about never giving up, but their eyes betrayed exhaustion. For them, the arrest of Javier Morales had not erased the memory of that November morning in 1998 when police knocked on their door and the world fractured without warning. Closure, the word reporters loved, felt insufficient and strangely hollow. As investigators pieced together the fuller narrative in court, details emerged that had never reached the public during the early years of the investigation. Javier had watched Laura for months, noting her routines with the same obsessive precision she applied to her studies. He knew when she ran in the park, when she returned from class, when she switched off her lights. What had once seemed like coincidence, a neighbor bumping into her on the stairs, now appeared calculated, rehearsed, the slow construction of proximity that masked intent. Witnesses recalled minor incidents that in isolation had seemed harmless. Javier offering to fix a flickering hallway light near Laura's floor, Javier asking about her schedule under the guise of managing noise, Javier lingering too long during brief conversations. None of it had triggered alarm in 1998. None of it had risen above the threshold of suspicion in a building where neighbors nodded politely and then retreated behind locked doors. The danger had been ordinary, wrapped in routine. The prosecution argued that the confrontation on the night of the murder was not spontaneous, but inevitable, the final act of a growing fixation. Phone records revealed a series of anonymous calls to Laura's landline in the weeks before her death, silent when answered, disconnected when she spoke. At the time, police had dismissed them as nuisance calls common in the late 1990s. Decades later, cross-referenced with billing archives and tower data, the calls trace back to a prepaid mobile purchase near Javier's workplace. The pattern tightened like a noose woven slowly across years. Inside the apartment, the reconstruction of events unfolded with clinical precision. Javier had entered under a pretext, perhaps invited and out of politeness, perhaps insisting on resolving a complaint. The argument escalated quickly. There were no neighbors reporting screams because the violence was swift, a single decisive blow delivered at close range. Panic followed. Javier wiped surfaces, adjusted the window latch to suggest intrusion, stepped back into the hallway, and descended 2 floors to his own apartment, carrying nothing but the belief that he had erased himself from the scene. He had not accounted for the microscopic. In 1998, forensic teams collected samples cautiously but lacked the capacity to amplify minimal traces. The swab beneath the window, initially categorized as low value, became the silent chronicle of his presence. Experts testified about polymerase chain reaction, about probabilistic genotyping, about statistical certainty measured in astronomical odds. Jurors listened as science translated a faint smear into an unmistakable identity, transforming doubt into near mathematical inevitability. For the community, the revelation sparked a complicated reckoning. Residents who had once lived in the building revisited their memories with a new lens, questioning every shared elevator ride, every polite greeting. Some felt anger at the original investigation, wondering whether sharper scrutiny might have shortened the decades of uncertainty. Others defended the detectives of 1998, acknowledging the technological limits of the time and the labyrinth of competing leads that had diverted attention. Retired investigators were interviewed on evening broadcasts, their voices steady but tinged with regret. They described the frustration of the early years, the exhaustion of chasing fragile tips, the moment when the file was reluctantly stamped inactive. None had forgotten Laura's name. None had entirely let go of the suspicion that the truth lay close to home. When the DNA match emerged, several admitted to feeling both vindicated and chastened, aware that the answer had always been within the building's walls. Javier's family endured a different kind of shock. His spouse, who had met him years after the murder, insisted she had known nothing of his past proximity to the case. Colleagues described him as reserved but reliable, a man of spreadsheets and predictable routines. The duality unsettled observers. How could someone capable of such violence maintain a facade of normalcy for so long? Psychologists invited onto talk shows spoke of compartmentalization, of the human capacity to divide guilt from daily life, of secrets buried beneath layers of habit. As sentencing approached, prosecutors emphasized the aggravating factor of deception, the deliberate staging of a crime scene, the calculated lie about leaving Madrid that weekend. Defense attorneys pleaded for recognition of the passage of time, of an otherwise law-abiding life lived in the decade since. The judge listened impassively, aware that beyond legal arguments lay a broader social narrative about accountability and the reach of modern forensics. When the sentence was delivered, substantial and unequivocal, it carried the weight of 25 years of suspended justice. Yet even after the courtroom emptied and the cameras pivoted to new stories, the echo of the case lingered. Universities invited forensic experts to lecture about the power of preserved evidence. Police departments across Spain initiated reviews of dormant files, re-examining samples once deemed too degraded to test. The phrase cold case began to sound less like surrender and more like a challenge, a reminder that time no longer guaranteed immunity. Laura's story entered textbooks and documentaries, framed as both tragedy and testament. Her photograph, once printed on fading posters, appeared on screens accompanied by discussions of genetic breakthroughs. Friends who had aged into middle adulthood spoke publicly for the first time about the years of doubt, about the birthdays marked by absence, about the way uncertainty can freeze grief in a perpetual present. Resolution allowed them to mourn without the corrosive question of who. The building itself underwent quiet transformation. New tenants moved in, some unaware of its history, others drawn by morbid curiosity. A small plaque was installed near the entrance at the request of Laura's parents, not detailing the crime but honoring her life and resilience. Residents gathered annually, not for vigil now, but for remembrance, choosing to reclaim the space from the shadow that had once defined it. In interviews following the sentencing, Laura's father reflected on the fragile thread that connected past to present, a thread woven from a single drop of blood preserved by protocol and patience. He spoke about the importance of never discarding evidence, of trusting that progress would eventually illuminate what seemed impossible. His words resonated beyond personal grief, touching a broader audience increasingly aware that justice can be delayed but not indefinitely denied. And still, beneath the narrative of triumph, a quiet unease persisted. The knowledge that Javier had lived undetected for decades unsettled a city that prided itself on vigilance. The case became a symbol of both failure and redemption, a reminder that ordinary spaces can conceal extraordinary darkness. Each retelling carried the same chilling detail, the same image of a broken window and a stain too small to matter until it mattered more than anything. As night falls over Madrid now, the streets hum with life, unaware of the silent histories embedded in brick and concrete. The cold case of 1998 no longer sits in an archive box, yet its legacy endures in laboratories, in courtrooms, in the collective memory of a community that learned patience the hard way. The forgotten DNA that once waited in darkness became a voice, clear and unyielding, proving that even the faintest trace can outlast fear, deception, and time itself. By the time the third year passed since Esteban Lujan's conviction, Buenos Aires had learned to live with a peculiar contradiction. Officially, justice had been served, yet unofficially, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado refused to rest because every document unearthed, every subpoena issued, seemed to widen the circle rather than close it, and the question that lingered in cafes, courtrooms, and city council corridors was no longer who pulled the trigger, but who else stood in the shadows when Martin Ferreira fell. The Special Investigative Unit operated quietly at first, poring over the photocopied contracts recovered from the storage room linked to Ricardo Bassi's former associates. The annotations in Ferreira's handwriting were meticulous, arrows pointing to inflated line items, percentages circled in red, cryptic initials scrawled beside payment schedules. Forensic analysts confirmed the ink dated back to early 2001. It was proof that Ferreira had mapped the scheme in detail, that he had followed the money further than anyone realized. Hidden architecture of fraud, silent accountant turned whistleblower, narrative shifting again. Prosecutors traced the initials from the contracts to mid-level officials who had since retired or transitioned into private consulting roles. One name surfaced repeatedly: Alejandro Quiroga, a former deputy in the municipal housing department who had maintained a low profile since the economic crisis. Bank records showed that a consultancy firm connected to Quiroga received transfers from the same subcontractor that had paid Bassi's company shortly after the murder. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Investigators began discreet surveillance, monitoring communications, financial movements, travel logs. Meanwhile, Carolina Vega's cooperation deepened. Under protective custody, she provided investigators with old appointment diaries she had kept hidden for years. Within their pages were dates, locations, and coded references to meetings between Lujan, Quiroga, and another unidentified participant labeled simply as El Jeef. The term sent a ripple through the investigative team. Was it a nickname, a title, or a deliberate exaggeration? Vega insisted it referred to someone higher than Lujan, someone whose political connections insulated him from scrutiny during the chaos of 2001. New hierarchy suggested, conspiracy expanding, public tension reignited. The media caught wind of Quiroga's involvement after a court filing inadvertently revealed his initials. News anchors revisited archival footage of him defending the housing project in press conferences 2 decades earlier, promising affordable homes for struggling families. The contrast between those promises and the newly exposed financial irregularities ignited outrage. Protesters gathered outside municipal offices carrying signs demanding accountability beyond a single businessman. The case that once centered on a quiet townhouse in Caballito now threatened to implicate an entire administrative era. As investigators pressed forward, they uncovered another startling detail: a previously overlooked security log from Lujan's dealership dated the night of the murder. The log recorded a vehicle leaving the premises shortly before midnight, authorized not by Lujan but by a security supervisor who later resigned abruptly in 2002 and relocated to Uruguay. Cross-referencing travel records confirmed the supervisor had met with Quiroga multiple times in the months following Ferreira's death. Strange coordination, synchronized departures, hidden choreography emerging from dusty files. Lucia Ferreira watched these developments with guarded determination. She had aged alongside the case, her hair streaked with gray, her resolve hardened. In interviews, she emphasized that her brother's integrity had never wavered, that he had been prepared to expose not just one corrupt client, but a network. She recalled childhood memories of Martin balancing household budgets for their parents, insisting on fairness even in trivial matters. Those recollections, broadcast across the nation, humanized the expanding investigation, anchoring complex financial revelations in the simple truth of a life cut short. The breakthrough came unexpectedly through digital forensics. Technicians managed to recover fragments from an obsolete hard drive seized from Quiroga's former office. Though much of the data had been wiped, residual files revealed encrypted spreadsheets matching figures annotated in Ferreira's photocopies. More chilling still, one recovered email draft referenced contingency measures should the auditor refuse cooperation. The language was indirect but unmistakable in tone. Obstacles must be removed before disclosure. The phrase reverberated through the investigative unit like an echo from 2001. Armed with this evidence, prosecutors convened a grand jury to consider additional indictments. Quiroga was summoned for questioning and appeared composed, flanked by attorneys. He denied any involvement in violence, portraying financial discrepancies as bureaucratic misunderstandings amplified by political rivals. Yet when confronted with the encrypted spreadsheets and the security log linking his associate to Lujan's dealership on the night of the murder, his confidence flickered. Observers described a momentary pause, a tightening of his jaw that spoke louder than his words. Public anticipation mounted as leaks from the proceedings filtered into headlines. Third suspect identified. Wider conspiracy probed. Justice not yet complete. The narrative evolved from cold case resolved to corruption saga unfolding. Citizens debated the implications in cafes and on social media, questioning how many opportunities for accountability had been missed in the turbulent aftermath of the economic collapse. The case became a lens through which the nation re-examined its past, its institutions, its tolerance for compromise. Under mounting pressure, the former security supervisor in Uruguay agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity on lesser charges. In a sworn statement, he claimed that on the night of the murder he drove Lujan and Quiroga to a location several blocks from Ferreira's home. He insisted he remained in the vehicle and did not witness the shooting, but he admitted hearing a sharp crack moments after Lujan and Quiroga entered the townhouse through the back. His testimony contradicted Vega's earlier account that only she and Lujan were present. New timeline, additional accomplice, truth fracturing under scrutiny. Confronted with this statement, Vega amended her testimony once more, acknowledging that fear had initially prevented her from naming Quiroga. She described him as the true architect of the housing project scheme, the one who panicked when Ferreira refused to alter his audit. According to Vega, Quiroga had urged decisive action, framing it as necessary to protect everyone involved. The shooting, she said, was executed by Lujan but sanctioned by Quiroga, with her role limited to arranging the meeting under false pretenses. The conspiracy tightened into a clearer shape, though gaps remained. Prosecutors moved swiftly, charging Quiroga with conspiracy to commit homicide and obstruction of justice. His arrest, conducted at dawn much like Lujan's, sent another shockwave through Buenos Aires. Cameras captured him shielding his face as officers escorted him into a federal vehicle. For many citizens, the image symbolized delayed reckoning. Yet others cautioned against premature celebration, aware that complex cases can unravel under legal challenge. As pretrial hearings commenced, defense attorneys for both Lujan and Quiroga sought to undermine Vega's credibility, highlighting inconsistencies in her evolving narrative. They argued that memories distorted by time and self-preservation could not support life-altering convictions. Prosecutors countered with forensic evidence, financial records, and corroborating testimony from the security supervisor. The courtroom atmosphere grew electric, layered with 2 decades of accumulated tension. Through every revelation, the memory of that August night in 2001 persisted like a heartbeat beneath the proceedings. The humid air, the single gunshot, the untouched wine glass, details repeated in testimony, dissected by experts, etched into the public imagination. What began as a mysterious disappearance of truth within a private kitchen had expanded into a confrontation with systemic corruption. The case no longer belonged solely to the Ferreira family. It belonged to a nation reconsidering the cost of silence. When Quiroga's trial finally opened, prosecutors presented a reconstructed timeline weaving together phone records, vehicle logs, and financial transfers. They argued that Ferreira's discovery of the inflated housing budgets threatened to expose a scheme funneling millions into private accounts during a period of national hardship. They portrayed the murder as a calculated act designed to preserve power at any cost. Defense attorneys insisted the evidence was circumstantial, the narrative speculative, the witnesses unreliable. The jury listened as the past was reconstructed piece by fragile piece. Outside the courthouse, candlelight vigils returned, smaller than before but steadier, as if the city had matured alongside the case. Speakers emphasized transparency, reform, vigilance. The name Martin Ferreira was spoken not with shock now, but with solemn respect. His refusal to compromise had become emblematic of a broader demand for integrity. Whatever verdict the jury would ultimately reach, one reality had already crystallized. The Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado was never a simple story of one unexpected arrest shaking a country. It was a prolonged excavation of truth buried beneath economic turmoil and political convenience. Each layer uncovered revealed another. Each confession opened further questions. And in the quiet moments between hearings, when cameras dimmed and crowds dispersed, the image remained of a man alone in his kitchen, documents prepared, determined to expose what others feared. The echo of that determination continued to reverberate through Buenos Aires, reminding a nation that justice can be delayed, distorted, even denied, but when persistence endures, the silence surrounding a single gunshot can evolve into a chorus demanding accountability that refuses to fade. When Alejandro Quiroga finally took the stand in his own defense, the courtroom in Buenos Aires seemed to hold its breath, as if the city itself were listening for a confession that might never come, because by then the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado had transformed from a reopened homicide into a national reckoning, and every word spoken under oath carried the weight of 2 decades of suspicion, corruption, and grief that refused to dissolve. Quiroga appeared older than the man preserved in archival news clips from 2001, his hair thinner, his voice measured, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating each question before answering. He denied orchestrating any scheme to silence Martin Ferreira, insisting that the housing project discrepancies were exaggerated accounting errors amplified by political rivals during a period of institutional chaos. He admitted meeting Luján the week of the murder, but claimed the discussion focused solely on damage control for negative press surrounding construction delays. According to him, Ferreira's death was a tragic act carried out without his knowledge, a reckless decision by Luján alone. The defense framed him as a bureaucrat caught in the crossfire of ambition and panic. Prosecutors countered with precision. They presented the encrypted spreadsheet fragments recovered from his hard drive, overlaying them with the photocopied contracts bearing Ferreira's annotations. Line by line, they demonstrated identical figures, identical percentage adjustments, identical phantom subcontractors. They displayed phone records placing Quiroga's device within range of Caballito cell towers the night of the murder, contradicting his earlier claim that he had been home. The atmosphere tightened with each exhibit. Mysterious disappearance, financial manipulation, proximity to crime scene, threads converging into a single narrative. Then came the testimony of the former security supervisor, his voice unsteady but resolute. He described driving Luján and Quiroga through dimly lit streets, parking with the engine idling, watching the 2 men exit the vehicle without a word. He recalled the humidity, the distant echo of protests from the city center, the way Luján returned minutes later pale and shaken while Quiroga remained unnervingly calm. He remembered being instructed to forget the night entirely. That instruction, he said, haunted him more than the gunshot. Community shock resurfaced in murmurs that rippled through the courtroom gallery. Carolina Vega testified again, this time with fewer evasions. She acknowledged her earlier omissions and described in detail the mounting pressure from Quiroga as Ferreira's audit neared completion. She recounted a meeting in an underground parking garage where Quiroga warned that exposure would not merely cost them money but could topple careers and trigger criminal investigations reaching far beyond the housing project. According to Vega, the phrase he used was containment at any cost. She described feeling trapped, complicit by proximity, terrified of the consequences of dissent. Her voice faltered only when she spoke of the moment she realized a line had been crossed that could never be erased. The defense attacked her credibility relentlessly, highlighting the evolution of her story, the benefits she received in exchange for cooperation. They argued that desperation and self-preservation had reshaped her memory. Yet forensic experts reinforced key aspects of her account. The fiber analysis linking the rare synthetic blend to Lujan's dealership vehicles, the ballistic match to a weapon type contracted through a security firm connected to both Lujan and Quiroga, the financial transfers that surged immediately after the murder as if stabilizing a threatened structure. The cumulative effect was suffocating. Outside the courthouse, public discourse intensified. Commentators revisited the broader climate of 2001, when economic collapse eroded trust and protests shook institutions to their core. Many argued that the chaos created an environment where decisions once unthinkable became rationalized as necessary survival. The Ferreira case, they said, was not an isolated tragedy, but a symptom of a system under extreme strain. Others insisted that crisis never excuses violence, that integrity is tested precisely when circumstances are dire. The debate extended beyond legal guilt into moral accountability. Lucia Ferreira attended every hearing, her presence a steady reminder of the human cost beneath layers of financial data and legal argument. She listened as lawyers debated percentages and procurement codes, and she wondered how her brother's quiet determination had ignited such fear. In a brief statement to reporters during a recess, she said that whatever verdict emerged, the exposure of truth already honored Martine's courage. Her words circulated widely, reframing the narrative once more from scandal to principle. As closing arguments approached, prosecutors painted a portrait of coordinated desperation. They argued that Quiroga, facing the imminent collapse of a lucrative scheme, chose to protect himself and his associates by endorsing lethal silence. They emphasized that while Lujan pulled the trigger, conspiracy does not require a hand on the weapon, only intent and agreement. They reminded jurors of the email draft referencing obstacles to be removed, of the synchronized financial maneuvers, of the cell tower data placing Quiroga near the scene. Their message was stark: power leveraged against truth. The defense urged caution, warning against constructing a narrative from circumstantial strands woven together by hindsight. They suggested that proximity is not proof, that ambiguous language in emails cannot substitute for direct evidence of intent to kill. They framed Quiroga as a convenient extension of outrage, another figure to absorb public anger generated by years of institutional distrust. In their view, the state sought a symbol as much as a conviction. When the jury retired to deliberate, Buenos Aires entered another period of suspended breath. News outlets replayed testimony highlights, analysts dissected legal standards, citizens debated outcomes in cafes and on crowded buses. The phrase arresto inesperado secured al país echoed again, this time anticipating a verdict that could either confirm a broader conspiracy or fracture the case into unresolved fragments. After days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom stood as the foreperson announced the decision: guilty of conspiracy to commit homicide and obstruction of justice. The words landed with both force and finality. Quiroga remained expressionless, but the tremor in his hands betrayed the magnitude of the moment. Outside, a subdued cheer rose from the gathered crowd, not triumphant but resolute, as if acknowledging that accountability had expanded beyond a single individual. Sentencing followed weeks later, imposing a lengthy prison term that, given Quiroga's age, would likely confine him for the remainder of his life. Lujan's earlier conviction remained intact despite appeals. Vega continued to serve her reduced sentence under protective conditions. The legal chapter that began with a humid August night in 2001 appeared, at last, structurally complete. Cold case reopened, conspiracy exposed, verdict delivered. Headlines crystallized the arc in bold type. Yet beneath the surface of closure lingered a deeper transformation. The investigation triggered reforms in municipal procurement oversight, stricter auditing protocols, and enhanced protections for whistleblowers. Law schools analyzed the case as a study in delayed justice facilitated by technological advancement and persistent advocacy. Journalists cited it when probing new allegations of corruption, invoking Ferreira's name as shorthand for vigilance. The echo of one gunshot had evolved into policy shifts and cultural introspection. In Caballito, the renovated townhouse stood quietly among others indistinguishable from the street, its windows reflecting ordinary sunlight. Passers-by might never guess the history contained within its walls, yet for those who remembered, it symbolized both vulnerability and resilience. On the 25th anniversary of the murder, a small ceremony unveiled a plaque honoring Martín Ferreira as an advocate for transparency. No grand speeches, no spectacle, just a collective acknowledgement that truth, though delayed, had surfaced through persistence. The Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado, Arresto Inesperado Secural Pace began as a headline announcing shock, evolved into a saga of layered conspiracies, and concluded as a testament to endurance. It revealed how easily power can distort justice when oversight falters, and how relentless inquiry can eventually restore balance. The city that once trembled under economic collapse learned that even in its darkest chapter, a single determined voice can reverberate across decades. And as night settles again over Caballito, the memory of that solitary gunshot remains not as a symbol of fear, but as a reminder that silence can be broken, that buried truths can rise, and that a nation, when confronted with its own reflection, can choose to confront the shadows rather than live within them. Years after the final sentencing, when the court transcripts had been archived and the television vans no longer crowded the courthouse steps, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado remained embedded in the national consciousness, like a scar that refused to fade, because although Esteban Lujan and Alejandro Quiroga were behind bars and the conspiracy had been laid bare in painstaking detail, the deeper impact of Martín Ferreira's death continued to ripple outward in ways no verdict could fully contain. At first, there was a sense of collective exhale, a belief that the system, though slow and flawed, had ultimately corrected itself. Editorials praised the perseverance of prosecutors, the courage of witnesses, the resilience of the Ferreira family. Lawmakers cited the case when debating transparency reforms, invoking it as proof that corruption, even when rooted in powerful offices, could eventually be dismantled. Yet beneath the public satisfaction lingered an unease shaped by a simple truth. It had taken nearly a quarter of a century for justice to emerge, and without advances in forensic technology and relentless pressure from a grieving sister, the truth might have remained buried forever. Lucia Ferreira often reflected on that paradox. She had spent more than half her life waiting for answers, navigating hope and despair in equal measure. In quiet interviews years later, she described how the passage of time alters grief, but does not erase it. The plaque outside her brother's former townhouse brought comfort, yet it also marked the permanence of loss. She spoke about Martín not as a symbol of reform, but as a man who loved classical music, who brewed coffee precisely, who believed rules existed to protect the vulnerable. Those personal details grounded the narrative that had grown so large it sometimes threatened to obscure the human core at its center. The housing project that sparked the conspiracy eventually resumed under new management, restructured with stricter oversight. Families who moved into the completed apartments were often unaware of the history tied to the land beneath their homes. For them, it was simply affordable housing secured after years of uncertainty. Yet within municipal offices, the project became shorthand for caution. Internal training sessions reference the failures of oversight from 2001, reminding new administrators how easily complacency can evolve into complicity. The name Ferreira surfaced in presentations not as accusation, but as warning. Academics dissected the case in conferences and journals, exploring how economic crises create fertile ground for ethical compromise. They analyzed the psychological dimensions of group decision-making under pressure, the way incremental rationalizations can culminate in catastrophic choices. Experts noted how Lujan and Quiroga did not begin as violent men, but as professionals navigating a collapsing system, gradually normalizing shortcuts until the unthinkable became, in their minds, necessary. This framing did not excuse their actions. Rather, it illuminated the pathways by which integrity erodes when accountability weakens. Forensic science laboratories cited the breakthrough fiber analysis and DNA re-examination as milestones in cold case methodology. The preservation of seemingly insignificant evidence, once dismissed as procedural routine, became a celebrated example of why meticulous documentation matters. Training programs emphasized that today's inconclusive sample might become tomorrow's decisive proof. The lesson extended beyond one case, reinforcing faith in patient, methodical inquiry. Yet even as institutional reform solidified, whispers occasionally resurfaced questioning whether every participant in the original scheme had truly been exposed. Some investigative journalists suggested that financial trails hinted at additional beneficiaries who had escaped scrutiny due to lack of direct evidence. Prosecutors maintained that the core conspiracy had been dismantled, that speculation without substantiation risked undermining public trust. The tension between closure and curiosity lingered, a reminder that complete certainty is rare in complex crimes. In Caballito, life continued with the ordinary rhythm of a residential neighborhood. Children played on sidewalks, bakeries opened at dawn, buses rattled past without pause. The townhouse where Martín Ferreira died changed owners again, its history disclosed discreetly in property records, but rarely discussed in daily conversation. Still, longtime residents occasionally recounted the night of the gunshot to newcomers, their voices lowering instinctively as if the memory retained a sacred gravity. The story had become part of local folklore, a narrative passed down not to frighten but to caution. Each anniversary of the murder brought a modest gathering beneath the plaque. No large crowds, no national broadcasts, just candles flickering against stone, and a few words spoken softly about integrity and remembrance. Lucia often attended, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by former colleagues of her brother who had aged alongside her. They shared quiet recollections, moments of laughter interwoven with solemn reflection. The ritual was less about reopening wounds and more about affirming that time had not erased meaning. Looking back, analysts identified several turning points that transformed the investigation from stagnation to resolution. The technological leap that reactivated dormant evidence, the courage of a reluctant witness who chose cooperation over silence, the willingness of a new generation of prosecutors to revisit old assumptions. These factors converged in a way that felt almost improbable, as if the case itself had resisted oblivion until the right conditions aligned. Cold case no more, unexpected arrests, systemic reckoning, phrases once splashed across headlines now settled into historical record. The broader public memory of 2001 also evolved. What had once been recalled primarily as a year of economic despair gradually incorporated the Ferreira case as a parallel narrative of moral testing. Commentators drew connections between financial collapse and ethical collapse, arguing that resilience requires not only economic recovery, but institutional integrity. In that sense, the resolution of the case symbolized more than punishment. It represented a step toward reconciling with a turbulent chapter in national history. For Lucia, however, the most profound transformation was internal. She often described how the pursuit of justice had shaped her identity, turning a private citizen into an advocate who navigated legal corridors and media scrutiny with unexpected strength. She acknowledged the toll it took, but also the purpose it provided. When asked whether she finally felt closure, she answered carefully. "Closure," she said, "is not a door that shuts. It is a landscape you learn to walk through without losing your balance." The final chapter of the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado is not marked by dramatic courtroom scenes or flashing cameras, but by quieter shifts in collective awareness. It is visible in stricter audit trails, in whistleblower protections strengthened by legislative reform, in young lawyers citing the case as inspiration for public service. It is present in the caution exercised by officials who remember how swiftly reputations can unravel when oversight fails. And it remains etched in the memory of a humid August night when a single gunshot echoed through Caballito and shattered the illusion that integrity alone guarantees safety. Martin Ferreira could not have known that his meticulous notes and steadfast refusal to compromise would ignite a chain of events spanning decades. He could not have foreseen the unexpected arrests, the unraveling conspiracy, the national introspection that followed. Yet his determination to document the truth ensured that, even in death, he left a trail impossible to ignore. As Buenos Aires moves forward, vibrant and restless as ever, the story endures not as a headline, but as a quiet undercurrent. It reminds the city that justice may falter but can be revived, that silence may conceal but cannot permanently erase, that even in times of upheaval the choices made in private rooms carry consequences that echo across generations. The plaque in Caballito catches the morning light, unremarkable to some, profound to others. Beneath it lies the memory of a man who believed in balance sheets and accountability, whose life was cut short, yet whose impact expanded far beyond the walls of his kitchen. And in that enduring echo, the nation finds both warning and resolve, a testament to the power of persistence when confronting the shadows that once seemed untouchable. A quarter of a century after the gunshot that pierced the humid night in Caballito, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado no longer dominated headlines, yet it lingered in the collective psyche like a low, persistent hum, a reminder that beneath the surface of any city lies a fragile contract between power and truth, and when that contract is broken, the consequences do not expire with a single verdict. In the years following the final convictions, the prison interviews began. Journalists, historians, and documentary filmmakers sought access to Esteban Lujan and Alejandro Quiroga, hoping to capture reflections from the men whose decisions had reshaped a nation's conversation about corruption. Lujan agreed to speak first, his once commanding demeanor reduced to measured restraint. He maintained that fear had driven him, that the chaos of 2001 had blurred his judgment until survival eclipsed morality. He described sleepless nights as protests raged outside banks and government buildings, investors fleeing, contracts collapsing. In his telling, the pressure was suffocating, the stakes existential. Yet when asked about Martin Ferreira, his voice faltered. He admitted that the accountant's refusal to bend had unsettled him more than any financial loss, because it exposed a weakness in a system built on quiet compliance. Quiroga's interviews were colder, more analytical. He spoke in abstract terms about institutional fragility and political vulnerability, framing the events as an unfortunate convergence of miscalculations. He avoided personal accountability, emphasizing procedural ambiguity rather than moral failure. Observers noted the contrast between his intellectual detachment and the emotional weight carried by the Ferreira family. The disparity underscored a lingering truth. Legal closure does not guarantee emotional reconciliation. Meanwhile, younger generations encountered the case not through breaking news, but through textbooks and streaming documentaries. University students debated the ethical dimensions of crisis governance, using the housing project scandal as a case study. They examined how incremental ethical compromises can accumulate into catastrophic outcomes, how the normalization of small irregularities erodes resistance to larger transgressions. Professors highlighted the role of persistence in uncovering truth, emphasizing that the case's resolution depended not on sudden revelation but on patient, methodical re-examination of overlooked evidence. Lucia Ferreira gradually stepped back from public advocacy, choosing a quieter life after decades in the spotlight. Yet her influence endured through nonprofit initiatives supporting whistleblowers and families of unresolved crime victims. She often spoke privately about the paradox of justice achieved too late to restore what was lost. Her reflections carried a maturity shaped by endurance rather than bitterness. She acknowledged that while the system ultimately responded, it did so only after extraordinary effort. That recognition fueled ongoing campaigns for procedural reforms aimed at preventing future delays. Within law enforcement agencies, the case became a benchmark for cold case management. Training modules dissected the initial investigative missteps, from prematurely narrowing suspect pools to underestimating the significance of trace evidence. Officers were taught to preserve materials meticulously, to document decisions transparently, to resist external pressures that might compromise objectivity. The fiber once dismissed as ordinary upholstery was now cited as a symbol of latent truth waiting for the right tools to surface. The broader cultural impact manifested in subtle ways. Artists reference the story in novels and films exploring themes of conscience and complicity. Playwrights dramatize the tension between loyalty and integrity, drawing loosely from the relationships among Lujan, Quiroga, and Vega. Though fictionalized, these works echoed real anxieties about power structures and the human capacity for rationalization. The narrative transcended its factual boundaries, evolving into a metaphor for societal crossroads. Even the housing project itself, once tainted by scandal, underwent transformation. Community leaders organized forums discussing transparency and civic engagement, inviting residents to participate in oversight committees. What had begun as a scheme marred by corruption gradually became a symbol of reclamation. Families living in those apartments expressed gratitude for affordable homes while acknowledging the troubled history that preceded them. The juxtaposition of shelter and scandal illustrated the complexity of public infrastructure shaped by flawed decisions. On quiet evenings in Caballito, long after media attention faded, neighbors sometimes recalled the night that altered their perception of safety. They remembered the police lights reflecting off windows, the hushed conversations in hallways, the sense that something larger than a single crime had unfolded. Over time, those memories softened but did not vanish. They became part of the neighborhood's identity, woven into its collective narrative like threads in a tapestry. Occasionally, new rumors surfaced suggesting undiscovered layers of the conspiracy, whispers fueled by the natural human reluctance to accept finality. Investigators reviewed such claims with measured diligence, yet none yielded substantive evidence beyond what had already been adjudicated. The legal record stood firm. Still, the persistence of speculation revealed an enduring skepticism shaped by history. In a society once shaken by institutional failure, trust rebuilds slowly and never without caution. The enduring lesson of the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado lies not solely in the punishment of those convicted, but in the illumination of vulnerability within systems assumed to be stable. It demonstrates how economic turmoil can distort ethical boundaries, how fear can metastasize into irreversible action. It also affirms that documentation, memory, and perseverance can counterbalance silence and intimidation. The trajectory from mysterious disappearance of truth to unexpected arrests that shook the nation illustrates the dynamic tension between concealment and exposure. As anniversaries accumulate, the narrative settles into history rather than headlines. Children who were not yet born in 2001 learn about the case as part of a broader chronicle of national transformation. They inherit both the cautionary elements and the hope embedded in its resolution. For them, the story is less immediate, yet no less instructive. It represents a chapter in the ongoing evolution of civic responsibility. And so the image returns, as it has in every retelling: a modest kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling beside an untouched glass of wine, a man who believed that accuracy and transparency were shields strong enough to withstand pressure. His belief proved tragically optimistic in the moment, yet ultimately prophetic in impact. Because the notes he left behind, the questions he refused to silence, ignited a chain reaction that outlived those who sought to suppress him. Buenos Aires continues to pulse with life, vibrant and restless, shaped by new challenges and ambitions. But beneath its movement flows an awareness sharpened by experience. The cold case, once consigned to dusty shelves, now stands as a testament to the endurance of inquiry. It reminds officials that oversight matters even when scrutiny feels inconvenient. It reminds citizens that vigilance is a shared responsibility. And it reminds families who wait for answers that time, though relentless, does not erase the possibility of truth. In the end, the echo of that single gunshot has transformed from a sound of terror into a resonance of accountability. It reverberates not through fear but through reform, not through secrecy but through scrutiny. The Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado remains a narrative of shock and revelation, of arrest and aftermath, of darkness confronted rather than ignored. And as night settles once more over Caballito, the city rests with the knowledge that while justice may arrive late, its arrival can reshape the landscape for generations, ensuring that silence is never again mistaken for safety. 3 decades after the humid night that shattered the quiet rhythm of Caballito, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado exists less as a crime story and more as a living memory etched into the architecture of the city itself, because time has not erased the resonance of Martín Ferrera's final stand. It has refined it, distilled it into a symbol of how fragile systems can fracture under pressure and how stubborn truth can outlast those who attempt to bury it. By the 30th anniversary, Buenos Aires had changed in ways unimaginable in 2001. Glass towers pierced the skyline where abandoned buildings once stood, digital infrastructure replaced paper trails, and surveillance cameras lined streets that had once relied on memory and rumor. Yet in legal circles and journalism schools, the Ferrera case remained required study, a narrative dissected not only for its dramatic arc but for its institutional implications. It was cited as proof that delayed justice, while imperfect, can still recalibrate a society's moral compass. Cold case reopened, conspiracy exposed, unexpected arrests that shook a nation. Phrases once breathless with urgency had matured into pillars of civic reflection. In prison, Lujan's health declined steadily. Reports described a man diminished not merely by age, but by the cumulative weight of isolation and notoriety. He rarely granted interviews anymore. Those who observed him noted a shift from defiance to introspection, though whether remorse accompanied that shift remained uncertain. Quiroga, by contrast, maintained his intellectual detachment, filing appeals long after legal avenues narrowed to technicalities. His arguments grew more abstract over time, less about innocence and more about procedural nuance, as if clinging to complexity could dilute accountability. Carolina Vega completed her reduced sentence under protective arrangements and vanished from public view. Some speculated she left the country again. Others believed she lived quietly under a different name. Her absence fueled curiosity, yet her role in unraveling the conspiracy remained acknowledged in legal records. She became an ambiguous figure in public discourse, both participant and catalyst, a reminder that complicity and courage can coexist uneasily within the same individual. Lucia Ferrera aged into a role she never sought, guardian of memory. She rarely appeared in media anymore, but on milestone anniversaries, she delivered measured statements emphasizing vigilance over vengeance. She often spoke of how her brother trusted documentation more than rhetoric, how he believed facts would speak for themselves if preserved carefully enough. That belief, she suggested, should guide future generations navigating their own crises. Her voice carried neither bitterness nor triumph, only a steady conviction shaped by endurance. The housing complex at the center of the original scandal became a microcosm of renewal. Community murals depicted abstract scales of justice intertwined with architectural blueprints, subtle tributes to transparency reclaimed from corruption. Residents organized annual forums discussing civic engagement, inviting auditors and legal scholars to explain procurement processes in accessible language. What began as a project tainted by fraud transformed into a hub of participatory oversight, an unintended legacy of the tragedy that preceded it. Academics expanded their analysis beyond local politics, comparing the case to international examples of crisis-driven corruption. They examined how economic instability amplifies fear, how fear accelerates ethical compromise, and how compromise, left unchecked, can escalate into violence. The Ferrera case became a cautionary tale cited in global discussions about governance under strain. It illustrated how individuals within institutions rationalize incremental misconduct until consequences become irreversible. Yet it also demonstrated that institutional resilience can emerge through transparency and reform once truth surfaces. Technological evolution played its own quiet role in sustaining the case's relevance. Advances in forensic preservation, digital archiving, and data recovery were frequently linked back to the breakthroughs that revived dormant evidence in the Ferrera investigation. Training academies displayed replicas of the annotated contracts and fiber samples as teaching tools, emphasizing that no detail is too small to matter. Young investigators learn to approach every scene with humility, aware that today's unanswered question might become tomorrow's revelation. Public memory, however, is never static. As new scandals and crises capture headlines, the emotional intensity surrounding the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado inevitably softened. Yet it never vanished. Instead, it resurfaced during debates about accountability, invoked by commentators warning against complacency. The phrase mysterious disappearance of documents still carried weight, shorthand for institutional blind spots. The echo of community shock served as a rhetorical checkpoint, a reminder of what happens when oversight fails. In Caballito, the townhouse changed hands again, renovated into a modern residence with little outward trace of its past. The plaque remained outside, modest and unobtrusive, catching sunlight during the day and shadow at night. Neighbors sometimes paused there, not out of morbid curiosity, but quiet respect. For those who remembered the original chaos, the space represented both vulnerability and resilience. For newcomers, it offered a brief lesson in local history, a story passed along during evening walks. Journalists occasionally revisited the case in long-form retrospectives, interviewing investigators who had once combed through dusty archives in pursuit of overlooked clues. They described the frustration of early dead ends, the thrill of forensic breakthroughs, the tension of high-profile arrests. Their recollections underscored how close the case had come to permanent obscurity, how easily evidence might have degraded beyond usefulness, how fragile the chain of discovery truly was. Perhaps the most enduring transformation occurred within public consciousness itself. The case shifted the narrative around whistleblowers from naive idealists to essential guardians of accountability. Legislative reforms strengthened protections for auditors and civil servants who raised concerns about irregularities. Training programs encouraged early reporting of discrepancies rather than silent tolerance. The name Martín Ferreira became synonymous not only with victimhood, but with principled resistance. And yet, despite all reform and remembrance, the fundamental tragedy remained unchanged. A life interrupted in a modest kitchen, a future erased in a single irreversible moment. No policy adjustment could restore that absence. No courtroom declaration could rewind the humid night when fear eclipsed reason. The narrative's power lies precisely in that tension between progress achieved and loss sustained. As Buenos Aires advances deeper into the 21st century, its skyline illuminated by technologies unimaginable in 2001, the story persists as a quiet undercurrent beneath the city's motion. It surfaces when contracts are audited with renewed scrutiny, when officials hesitate before approving questionable expenditures, when citizens demand clarity instead of assurances. It whispers that integrity tested under pressure defines not only individuals, but entire institutions. The Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado began as a shocking headline, evolved into a labyrinth of conspiracy, and ultimately matured into a touchstone of civic reflection. Unexpected arrests shook the nation, but the deeper tremor reshaped its standards. In the end, the echo of that single gunshot has transcended fear and become a resonance of responsibility. It reminds a restless, vibrant city that truth may falter in darkness, yet endure in memory, that silence can delay justice, but cannot extinguish it, and that even in the shadow of crisis, the steadfast act of documenting reality can outlive those who seek to suppress it. On the 40th anniversary of the night that once fractured Caballito's quiet rhythm, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado no longer felt like a reopened wound, but like a scar that the city had learned to live with, visible yet no longer raw, a reminder that pain endured can transform into vigilance, sustained across generations. The children who now rode bicycles past the townhouse had been born long after the humid evening when Martín Ferreira failed to return from his kitchen, and yet they knew his name from civic lessons taught in their schools, where teachers described him not as a martyr, but as a public servant who believed documentation was a moral act. Time had thinned the circle of direct witnesses. Detectives who once sifted through dusty file boxes had retired, some passing away, others writing memoirs that blended professional pride with private doubt. They admitted how uncertain they had felt when the case was first reopened, how fragile the recovered fibers and reconstructed contracts seemed against decades of institutional silence. Their reflections revealed an uncomfortable truth. Justice had depended as much on persistence as on proof, on the willingness of individuals to believe that a story buried could still breathe again. Buenos Aires itself had evolved into a metropolis that moved at digital speed, yet in certain neighborhoods, including Caballito, memory lingered in slower rhythms. Cafes displayed archival photographs during anniversary weeks, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to illustrate transformation. The housing complex, once synonymous with corruption, now operated as a cooperative model studied by urban planners. Residents took pride in transparent budgeting meetings streamed online, their openness a deliberate inversion of the secrecy that had once poisoned the project's foundation. Lucia Ferreira, now elderly, spoke rarely in public, but when she did, her words carried the distilled clarity of decades spent guarding remembrance, without allowing it to harden into bitterness. She often described grief as an evolving landscape rather than a fixed state, explaining that early years were dominated by anger and disbelief, while later years demanded patience and perspective. She emphasized that the cold case reopened did not resurrect her brother, but it restored coherence to a narrative that had been deliberately fractured. Without that coherence, she said, healing would have been impossible. In academic circles, the case had become a longitudinal study in delayed accountability. Researchers tracked how legal reforms inspired by the investigation affected procurement transparency, comparing metrics from before and after the conspiracy exposed. They found measurable declines in irregular contracting practices, though never complete eradication. Corruption, they concluded, adapts like any organism under pressure, but the Ferreira case proved that adaptation can be countered by sustained scrutiny. It offered evidence that reform born from tragedy can endure if continuously reinforced. For younger journalists, the story represented both inspiration and warning. Journalism schools dissected the mysterious disappearance of documents that had once stalled progress, teaching students to safeguard archives in multiple formats and locations. Digital redundancy became standard practice, a procedural homage to the near loss that almost consigned the truth to permanent obscurity. Veteran reporters mentored newcomers with anecdotes about threats whispered off record, about nights spent questioning whether persistence was worth personal risk. The case reminded them that courage is rarely dramatic in the moment. It is repetitive, patient, often lonely. Meanwhile, the legal community reflected on the conspiracy uncovered not as an aberration but as a systemic failure rooted in economic desperation. Analysts revisited the financial crisis that had shaken Argentina in 2001, exploring how fear of collapse had provided cover for opportunists willing to manipulate public funds. They argued that ethical erosion rarely begins with grand schemes. It begins with rationalizations framed as temporary compromises. The Ferreira investigation illustrated how such compromises accumulate until they demand silence enforced by violence. Within prisons, the principal figures of the conspiracy aged into obscurity. Appeals had long since exhausted their momentum. Public attention drifted toward newer scandals, yet the names Lujan and Quiroga retained a quiet infamy in legal textbooks. Their downfall was studied less for personal drama and more for procedural evolution, how investigative independence strengthened when shielded from political interference, how evidentiary standards adapted to incorporate emerging forensic techniques. The individuals faded, the structural lessons remained. Community commemorations grew subtler over time. Instead of candlelight vigils, residents organized forums on civic ethics, inviting students to present research projects on transparency. They debated the balance between privacy and surveillance in a city saturated with cameras, acknowledging that technology which aids accountability can also threaten civil liberties if unchecked. The case provided historical grounding for these debates, a reminder that power requires oversight regardless of the tools employed. The townhouse itself stood renovated yet understated, its facade blending into the architectural mosaic of Caballito. The plaque endured, weathered but legible, a modest testament that resisted both grandiosity and erasure. Visitors sometimes left small flowers, though not in ritualized patterns. The site had transitioned from crime scene to landmark to quiet reference point, integrated into the neighborhood's identity without dominating it. As decades accumulated, narratives surrounding the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado shifted from shock to reflection to integration. It became part of the city's civic DNA, invoked during legislative debates, cited in academic theses, referenced in documentaries exploring institutional trust. Its emotional temperature cooled, yet its ethical temperature remained warm, a steady glow that illuminated discussions about responsibility. Technology continued to advance, enabling predictive analytics in auditing processes that flagged irregular contracts before funds could be diverted. Developers sometimes credited the Ferreira case for accelerating investment in such systems, arguing that prevention is more humane than prosecution. Yet seasoned observers cautioned against technological complacency, reminding audiences that tools are only as principled as the hands that wield them. The lesson of 2001 was not that algorithms can replace integrity, but that integrity must guide every innovation. International observers occasionally compared Argentina's experience with similar cases abroad, drawing parallels between economic instability and governance breakdowns in other nations. Conferences featured panels analyzing how community shock can catalyze reform if channeled constructively. The Ferreira case often served as a hopeful counterpoint to narratives of perpetual impunity, demonstrating that even entrenched networks can unravel when evidence resurfaces and public will aligns with investigative resolve. For Lucia, however, global recognition mattered less than personal remembrance. In private interviews conducted for archival preservation, she described her brother's ordinary habits, how he annotated documents meticulously, how he double-checked figures before submitting reports, how he believed that small inaccuracies signal larger distortions. These recollections humanized a figure, sometimes reduced to symbol. They reminded listeners that systemic change often begins with individuals performing unglamorous duties faithfully. As the 50th year approached, municipal authorities debated establishing a permanent educational center dedicated to transparency and civic responsibility, potentially bearing Ferreira's name. The proposal sparked discussion about the ethics of memorialization, whether institutionalizing memory risks sanitizing it, whether embedding tragedy into official narratives diminishes its raw instructive power. Ultimately, consensus formed around a dynamic space focused on training and dialogue rather than static exhibition, aligning remembrance with forward motion. In everyday life, most residents rarely contemplated the case. They navigated traffic, pursued careers, raised families, argued politics, and planned futures shaped more by contemporary concerns than by history. Yet the frameworks protecting their civic infrastructure bore subtle imprints of the investigation. Procurement portals published real-time expenditures. Whistleblower channels operated with anonymity safeguards. Oversight committees included citizen representatives by default rather than exception. These normalized practices were quiet descendants of a crisis, once considered insurmountable. The enduring paradox of the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado lies in its dual identity as both tragedy and teacher. It began with a single irreversible act in a modest kitchen and expanded into a national reckoning that redefined standards of accountability. It revealed how fragile ethical systems can be under strain, yet also how resilient collective conscience can become when confronted with undeniable evidence. In the end, the story does not conclude with verdicts or anniversaries. It persists in the habits of auditors who refuse to ignore discrepancies, in journalists who safeguard archives redundantly, in citizens who demand clarity before consent. It endures in the understanding that silence may delay justice, but cannot nullify it if memory remains vigilant. Buenos Aires moves forward, luminous and imperfect, carrying within its restless energy the quiet conviction that truth, once uncovered, obliges stewardship across generations. Half a century after the humid January night that once fractured the quiet rhythm of Caballito, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado had settled into the city's collective consciousness, not as a headline, but as an inheritance, something passed down in classrooms, civic meetings, and family conversations as both warning and compass. 50 years is long enough for grief to evolve into legacy, for outrage to refine into principle, and for the shock of unexpected arrests that shook a nation to transform into a foundational chapter in Argentina's ongoing negotiation with transparency and power. The Buenos Aires skyline bore little resemblance to its early 21st century silhouette. Elevated transit lines traced new paths above avenues once clogged with traffic, and digital governance platforms replaced bureaucratic labyrinths of paper and stamped forms. Yet beneath these visible transformations lay subtler shifts shaped in part by the conspiracy exposed decades earlier. Procurement systems operated on open ledgers accessible to any citizen with an internet connection, a structural safeguard inspired by the mysterious disappearance of documents that had once nearly erased accountability. Institutional memory, encoded into software and law, functioned as a barrier against the quiet accumulation of secrecy. Few direct participants in the case remained alive. Investigators who had reopened the file in the early 2010s were remembered through recorded interviews archived in national libraries. Their recollections revealed how improbable success had seemed when the first fibers were re-examined and faded contracts reconstructed. They described moments of doubt when political resistance threatened to stall momentum, when whispers warned them that certain names were too powerful to confront. Looking back across decades, their persistence appeared inevitable, but in truth it had been fragile, dependent on individuals choosing courage over convenience. Lucia Ferreira did not live to see the 50th anniversary, but her voice endured through recordings preserved by journalists and historians. In them she spoke not only of her brother's death, but of the moral clarity she believed documentation provided. She often said that facts, when safeguarded, outlast intimidation. Her calm articulation of that belief resonated across generations, shaping the tone of commemorations that avoided spectacle and instead emphasized responsibility. She became less a grieving sister in public imagination and more a steward of principle whose quiet endurance helped transform private loss into civic reform. The housing complex, once synonymous with fraud and betrayal, had become a case study in participatory urban management. Residents rotated leadership roles and published quarterly financial summaries, practices unimaginable during the crisis era that birthed the conspiracy. University students conducted fieldwork there, interviewing community members about how historical trauma influenced present governance. Many residents admitted that the shadow of the past remained, but they described it as motivational rather than paralyzing. Transparency was not a ceremonial gesture. It was a lived habit born from memory. International scholars continued to analyze the case within broader discussions of institutional resilience. They compared Argentina's trajectory with nations where similar scandals dissolved into permanent cynicism. What distinguished the Ferreira investigation, they argued, was not the scale of corruption but the depth of reform that followed exposure. The cold case reopened became a pivot point, demonstrating that delayed justice can catalyze durable structural change if accompanied by public engagement rather than mere punishment. It challenged fatalistic narratives, suggesting that entrenched networks are immune to accountability. Technological advances further distanced contemporary governance from the vulnerabilities of 2001. Artificial intelligence systems flagged irregularities in public spending before contracts were finalized, reducing opportunities for manipulation. Yet policymakers frequently invoked the lessons of the conspiracy uncovered to caution against blind trust in automation. They insisted that ethical oversight must accompany innovation, that transparency requires human judgment as well as digital precision. The tragedy that began in a modest kitchen thus continued to influence debates about the boundaries of technological authority. Commemorative events on the 50th anniversary unfolded with measured solemnity. Rather than reenactments or dramatic retrospectives, organizers hosted public forums exploring the evolution of whistleblower protections and investigative journalism. Younger attendees, many encountering the narrative in depth for the first time, expressed surprise that such systemic vulnerability had once seemed ordinary. For them, open data portals and citizen oversight committees were baseline expectations. The story of the conspiracy exposed functioned as a reminder that these norms were neither automatic nor guaranteed. In Caballito, the townhouse remained part of the neighborhood's fabric, renovated yet modest. The plaque marking the site had been restored, but not enlarged. Its restrained presence mirrored the city's approach to remembrance, acknowledgement without exploitation. Local residents described the house as a landmark of conscience rather than of tragedy, a point on the map where ethics intersected with everyday life. Children learned its history not through sensational tales, but through discussions about accountability in their civics classes. The principal figures convicted in the case had long since passed away, their names receding into archival records. Historians treated them as examples of how ambition distorted by fear can rationalize escalating compromise. They emphasized that the crisis context of 2001 did not excuse misconduct, but explain the environment in which ethical boundaries eroded. By situating individual choices within systemic pressure, scholars aim to prevent simplistic narratives that isolate villains without interrogating structures. Media retrospectives on the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado adopted a reflective tone, focusing less on dramatic revelations and more on longitudinal impact. Journalists interviewed policymakers who credited the investigation with inspiring careers dedicated to public service reform. They highlighted how the case influenced legislation strengthening archival preservation, ensuring that the mysterious disappearance of documents would be far less feasible in future administrations. In this way, absence itself became generative, prompting protective measures that safeguarded collective memory. Across Argentina, civic organizations referenced the case when advocating for transparency initiatives. It served as common ground in polarized debates, a historical episode acknowledged across ideological lines as a failure that demanded vigilance. The narrative's endurance suggested that certain lessons can transcend partisan divides when anchored in shared experience of shock and subsequent reform. Yet beneath institutional transformation lay the enduring simplicity of the original loss. A man committed to accurate accounting never returned from his kitchen. A sister spent decades navigating grief in public view. Neighbors grappled with fear before reclaiming trust. These human dimensions prevented the story from dissolving into abstraction. They grounded policy discussions in lived reality, reminding decision-makers that corruption is not merely financial deviation but an erosion that can culminate in irreversible harm. As the 50th year drew to a close, commentators observed that the case's most profound legacy was cultural rather than procedural. It instilled a reflex of questioning, a hesitation before accepting opaque explanations. It normalized scrutiny as civic duty rather than suspicion as disloyalty. In doing so, it reshaped the relationship between citizens and institutions, encouraging engagement over resignation. The Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado thus occupies a paradoxical place in national memory. It began as a rupture, evolved into a reckoning, and matured into a reference point for ethical governance. Its power no longer lies in the shock of unexpected arrests or the intrigue of a conspiracy exposed, but in the steady influence it exerts on daily administrative practice and public expectation. Cities, like people, accumulate stories that define their character. Some are celebratory, others cautionary. This story remains both. It affirms that even after decades of silence, truth can re-emerge through persistence. It warns that crises amplify vulnerability to compromise. And it demonstrates that remembrance, when coupled with reform, can convert tragedy into a durable framework for integrity. Buenos Aires continues to evolve, vibrant and complex, its streets animated by new generations unaware of the fear that once gripped Caballito. Yet embedded within its governance systems and civic culture is the quiet echo of that humid night in 2001. The echo no longer startles, it steadies. It reminds the city that accountability must be renewed continually, that transparency is not a milestone but a maintenance practice, and that the documentation of truth, however mundane it may seem, can outlive intimidation and shape the moral architecture of a nation for half a century and beyond. More than 60 years after the night that once splintered the calm of Caballito, The Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado had transcended the boundaries of criminal investigation and entered the realm of civic mythology, not as a legend exaggerated by time, but as a carefully documented sequence of events that reshaped a nation's understanding of accountability. What began as a single act of violence inside a modest townhouse evolved into a decades-long confrontation with secrecy, fear, and institutional decay, and by the sixth decade its influence could be traced through policies, technologies, and cultural attitudes that defined contemporary Argentina. The city itself had become almost unrecognizable compared to its early 21st century form. Autonomous buses glided along redesigned avenues, and civic dashboards projected real-time public spending metrics onto interactive displays in municipal buildings. Yet despite the technological sophistication, the lessons drawn from the conspiracy uncovered in 2001 remained strikingly human in focus. Policymakers frequently emphasized that transparency begins with individual integrity, that systems can only reflect the values of those who maintain them. The name Martín Ferreira was no longer invoked with the immediacy of grief, but with the steadiness of principle, a shorthand for the belief that meticulous documentation can challenge entrenched power. The educational curriculum across Argentina integrated the case into broader studies of democratic resilience. Students analyzed the economic crisis that framed the original corruption, exploring how desperation can erode ethical guardrails if left unchecked. They examined the mysterious disappearance of documents as a turning point, a cautionary example of how information control can distort justice. Rather than treating the episode as distant history, educators framed it as an evolving dialogue between citizens and institutions, encouraging critical engagement rather than passive remembrance. By this stage, most archival materials related to the investigation had been digitized and cross-referenced with international transparency databases. Researchers from other countries accessed the files to compare methodologies for reopening dormant cases. The cold case reopened in Buenos Aires became a model cited in global forums, demonstrating how advances in forensic preservation and political independence can converge to revive seemingly lost evidence. Yet analysts consistently noted that technological tools alone would have been insufficient without the persistence of individuals willing to question official narratives decades after initial closure. Public commemoration of the case adopted a tone of sober reflection rather than ceremony. On significant anniversaries, civic leaders hosted forums discussing emerging challenges to transparency, from algorithmic bias to cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The original conspiracy exposed served as a historical anchor in these conversations, reminding participants that corruption adapts alongside innovation. The tragedy of 2001 was thus reframed not as a relic, but as a reference point for navigating contemporary complexity. The townhouse in Caballito remained standing, preserved through successive renovations that respected its historical significance without transforming it into a museum. Visitors occasionally paused before the modest plaque, reading a concise account of the events that unfolded there. The restraint of the site mirrored the city's broader approach to memory, acknowledgement grounded in fact rather than dramatization. Neighborhood residents described the location as part of their shared landscape, neither sacred nor sensational, but instructive. In the decades since the unexpected arrests that once stunned the nation, Argentina's legal framework had matured in response to the vulnerabilities revealed. Whistleblower protections expanded, archival protocols strengthened, and independent oversight bodies gained constitutional safeguards. Scholars debated whether these reforms would have emerged absent the shock of the investigation's revelations. Many concluded that systemic change often requires a catalytic moment, a narrative capable of mobilizing public will. The Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado provided precisely such a narrative, bridging personal tragedy and collective reform. Generational distance altered emotional resonance, but did not diminish relevance. Younger citizens encountered the story through interactive documentaries and digital archives, exploring timelines that mapped each procedural breakthrough. They learned how the conspiracy uncovered had once appeared impenetrable, shielded by political alliances and bureaucratic inertia. The gradual unraveling of that shield illustrated a central democratic lesson. opacity can endure for years, yet it remains vulnerable to sustained scrutiny. Historians analyzing the period highlighted the interplay between crisis and character. They argued that the economic instability of 2001 created fertile ground for rationalizing misconduct, but they resisted deterministic interpretations. Instead, they emphasized choice, noting that many officials confronted similar pressures without succumbing to corruption. The divergence between those who compromised and those who resisted formed the ethical core of the case's enduring significance. Civic culture evolved in subtle ways influenced by this history. Public debates about government spending routinely referenced transparency benchmarks established in the aftermath of the investigation. Citizens expected access to information as a default right rather than a negotiated privilege. Media outlets, mindful of past failures, invested heavily in archival security and investigative training. The memory of documents nearly lost to neglect functioned as a perpetual incentive to preserve evidence meticulously. International observers continued to cite Argentina's experience when advising countries grappling with entrenched corruption. They pointed to the reopening of the cold case as proof that institutional rot is not irreversible. However, they also cautioned that reform requires sustained engagement beyond headline moments. The Argentine example demonstrated that accountability achieved once must be reinforced repeatedly to prevent regression. Personal stories associated with the case retained quiet potency. Though direct relatives of the principal figures had largely withdrawn from public discourse, oral histories preserved their reflections on living in the shadow of notoriety. These testimonies complicated simplistic narratives of villainy and virtue, revealing how systemic failure reverberates through families and communities long after court proceedings conclude. Such nuance enriched public understanding, preventing the story from calcifying into caricature. As the 60th anniversary approached, civic leaders convened a symposium examining the broader theme of institutional memory. Participants explored how societies choose which events to memorialize and which to allow fading into obscurity. The consensus affirmed that the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado warranted continued attention not because it was uniquely dramatic, but because it illuminated universal vulnerabilities. By confronting those vulnerabilities openly, Argentina strengthened its democratic fabric. In everyday life, however, the case rarely dominated conversation. The city thrived with cultural festivals, technological innovation, and political debate unrelated to events of the early 2000s. Yet beneath this dynamism lay embedded safeguards inspired by the past. Procurement algorithms flagged irregularities before contracts were approved. Independent auditors operated with statutory autonomy. Citizen oversight councils reviewed major infrastructure projects as a matter of routine practice. These normalized mechanisms represented the quiet triumph of lessons learned through hardship. The enduring power of the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado lies not in the singularity of its tragedy, but in the continuity of its influence. It demonstrates that justice delayed need not be justice denied if perseverance endures. It reveals how documentation, often perceived as mundane bureaucracy, can become a bulwark against coercion. It affirms that collective memory, when nurtured responsibly, can guide institutional evolution rather than imprison a society in perpetual grievance. Cities accumulate layers of history, some celebratory, others sobering. Buenos Aires carries this story as one of its formative layers, woven into policies and expectations that define civic life. The humid night that once shattered a family's future has become a reference point for national resilience. Its echo no longer reverberates as shock but as steady counsel, reminding each generation that transparency demands vigilance, that crises test character, and that truth, carefully preserved and patiently pursued, can outlast fear, power, and the passage of time itself. 70 years after the humid January night that once ruptured the quiet rhythm of Caballito, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado no longer belonged solely to the realm of criminal history. It had become a structural reference point embedded within Argentina's democratic identity. A narrative invoked not to reopen wounds, but to recalibrate vigilance whenever complacency threatened to dull public conscience. The distance of 7 decades granted perspective without erasure, allowing the nation to examine the arc from violence to reform with clarity that earlier generations, still navigating shock and grief, could scarcely afford. Buenos Aires in this era operated within a civic ecosystem shaped by layers of reform that trace their origins, at least in part, to the conspiracy uncovered in the early 21st century. Governance platforms integrated blockchain verification for public contracts, ensuring that the mysterious disappearance of documents that once obstructed justice could not be replicated without leaving indelible traces. Transparency was no longer a slogan appended to policy speeches. It was coded into infrastructure, audited continuously by independent agencies whose autonomy had been constitutionally fortified in the decades following the unexpected arrests that once stunned the nation. The educational system treated the case as a longitudinal study in ethical decision-making under pressure. Students explored archival footage of early news reports, analyzed economic data from the 2001 financial crisis, and debated the moral inflection points faced by officials entangled in the housing project scandal. Rather than presenting the principal figures as abstract villains, instructors emphasized the incremental nature of compromise, illustrating how rationalizations accumulate until resistance feels impractical and silence appears safer than dissent. Through this lens, Martín Ferreira's meticulous documentation became a counterpoint, a demonstration that small acts of integrity can reverberate across decades. Historians at the National Archive curated an immersive digital exhibit mapping the evolution of the investigation from stagnation to breakthrough. Visitors navigated interactive timelines showing how the cold case reopened through advances in forensic analysis and renewed prosecutorial independence. The exhibit highlighted moments when progress nearly faltered, underscoring that justice's trajectory was neither linear nor guaranteed. By foregrounding uncertainty, curators resisted mythologizing inevitability, reminding audiences that outcomes hinged on contingent choices made by individuals willing to challenge entrenched interests. In Caballito, the townhouse remained a quiet landmark woven into the neighborhood's daily life. Urban planners had resisted proposals to transform it into a monumental museum, opting instead for preservation integrated with residential continuity. The modest plaque affixed to its exterior was periodically restored but never embellished, its restraint reflecting a collective decision to honor the past without calm modifying tragedy. Residents described the house as a point of orientation within community memory, a place where conversations about ethics felt grounded rather than abstract. Public discourse surrounding the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado matured into a nuanced examination of systemic vulnerability. Commentators acknowledged that while reforms significantly reduced opportunities for procurement fraud, no framework could eliminate risk entirely. Corruption, they argued, adapts to constraints, seeking new pathways when old ones close. The lesson drawn from 2001 was therefore not complacent confidence, but perpetual attentiveness. Annual transparency reports explicitly referenced historical precedents, framing contemporary metrics within the context of earlier failures. Technological advancements introduced new ethical dilemmas unimagined at the turn of the century. Artificial intelligence systems predicted budgetary anomalies with remarkable accuracy, yet debates emerged regarding algorithmic bias and accountability. Policymakers frequently cited the conspiracy exposed decades earlier to emphasize that oversight mechanisms must themselves be subject to scrutiny. They insisted that transparency applies not only to human decision-makers, but also to the digital architectures that now mediated public administration. The legal profession continued to study the procedural milestones achieved during the case's reopening. Law students examined court transcripts illustrating how evidentiary standards evolved to accommodate long-dormant forensic material. They analyzed judicial opinions that balanced defendants' rights with society's demand for accountability. Through these studies, the case functioned as a living textbook, demonstrating the judiciary's capacity to adapt without compromising fundamental principles. Internationally, Argentina's experience was referenced in comparative governance research exploring how nations recover from corruption scandals intertwined with economic crisis. Scholars contrasted the Argentine trajectory with countries where similar conspiracies dissolved into entrenched cynicism. They concluded that the critical differentiator lay in sustained civic engagement following exposure. The unexpected arrests had sparked initial shock, but enduring reform emerged only because public attention translated into legislative action and institutional restructuring. Cultural representations of the case evolved as well. Documentary filmmakers adopted restrained storytelling approaches, privileging archival footage and measured commentary over dramatization. Novelists and playwrights drew thematic inspiration from the moral tensions embedded within the narrative, crafting fictional accounts that examined conscience under duress. These artistic interpretations expanded the story's reach beyond policy circles, embedding its lessons within the broader cultural imagination. Despite generational distance, the human core of the tragedy remained central to its resonance. Oral histories preserved recollections of neighbors who had once grappled with fear and uncertainty in the immediate aftermath. They described the initial confusion, the uneasy silence that followed official reassurances, and the gradual emergence of doubt that propelled renewed investigation. These testimonies anchored the narrative in lived experience, preventing abstraction from eclipsing empathy. As Argentina approached the centennial of the economic crisis that framed the original corruption, scholars revisited macroeconomic data to contextualize ethical breakdown within structural instability. They cautioned against simplistic attributions that blamed crisis alone, emphasizing that adversity tests but does not dictate character. The divergence between those who exploited chaos and those who resisted it formed a recurring theme in symposium discussions, reinforcing the idea that accountability ultimately rests upon individual agency within collective systems. Civic institutions developed commemorative practices that blended remembrance with forward-looking commitment. On milestone anniversaries, municipalities organized public audits of major infrastructure projects, inviting citizens to observe and question procurement processes in real time. These events symbolized a reversal of the opacity that once enabled conspiracy. They signaled that transparency is not static achievement, but ongoing performance requiring participation from both officials and the public. In everyday life, however, the case seldom dominated headlines. Buenos Aires thrived as a cultural and technological hub, its residents preoccupied with contemporary challenges and aspirations. Yet embedded within municipal protocols and national legislation were provisions traceable to reforms enacted in the wake of the conspiracy uncovered decades earlier. These provisions operated quietly, their origins often unremarked, yet their presence testified to the durability of lessons learned through hardship. The Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado thus occupies a singular position in Argentina's historical continuum. It began as a rupture marked by violence and denial, progressed through years of uncertainty and rediscovery, and matured into a framework guiding ethical governance. Its endurance illustrates that while time can soften emotional intensity, it need not dilute moral clarity. 70 years on, the humid night in Caballito is remembered not for spectacle, but for consequence. It revealed how fragile systems can fracture when oversight weakens, and how steadfast commitment to evidence can restore integrity even after prolonged silence. The echo of that night persists not as alarm but as counsel, woven into the civic fabric of Buenos Aires. It reminds each generation that transparency demands renewal, that crisis exposes character, and that truth, patiently documented and courageously pursued, can outlast fear, power, and the relentless passage of decades, shaping a nation's democratic architecture far beyond the lifespan of those who first bore its cost. Nearly a century after the humid January night that once fractured the quiet streets of Caballito, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado stood not merely as a historical episode, but as a mirror held up to the evolution of an entire society, a reminder that a single act of courage and a single moment of violence can ripple through decades, altering the expectations citizens hold toward power, truth, and justice. The passage of time had softened the rawness of the original shock, yet it had sharpened the clarity of its meaning. What once erupted as a national scandal had matured into a foundational lesson woven into Argentina's democratic memory, a narrative told not with the urgency of breaking news, but with the steady weight of experience. Buenos Aires itself had transformed into a sprawling metropolis whose technological sophistication would have seemed unimaginable to those living through the chaos of the early 2000s. Autonomous infrastructure regulated traffic flows, civic platforms allowed citizens to audit municipal budgets in real time, and decentralized archival systems ensured that public records could no longer vanish without leaving an indelible digital trail. Yet beneath the complexity of these innovations lay a philosophical framework shaped by a story that began in a modest townhouse where a man who believed in the power of documentation paid for that belief with his life. The name Martín Ferreira had long since passed from daily conversation, but the principle he embodied persisted quietly inside the architecture of institutions designed to resist secrecy. Historians studying the early 21st century described the case as a hinge moment between two eras of Argentine governance. Before it, opacity had been tolerated as an unfortunate but inevitable feature of bureaucracy. After it, transparency became an expectation codified into law and reinforced by public culture. The conspiracy uncovered in the investigation revealed not only individual corruption but also the structural weaknesses that allowed such corruption to flourish during moments of national instability. In confronting those weaknesses, Argentina initiated reforms that reshaped procurement systems, judicial oversight, and archival preservation for generations. The townhouse in Caballito still stood, surrounded now by buildings that reflected decades of urban renewal. The neighborhood had grown denser, its streets busier, yet the quiet corner where the plaque marked the events of that night retained a subdued gravity. Visitors occasionally paused there, reading the short inscription that summarized the case in a handful of lines. The brevity of the text contrasted with the vast consequences that unfolded afterward, reminding those who stopped that history often pivots on moments too ordinary to appear significant at first glance. Inside academic institutions, the case continued to serve as a reference point for discussions about ethical governance. Law students examined transcripts from the reopening of the investigation to understand how legal systems confront evidence preserved across decades. Political science scholars explored how public outrage transformed into sustained institutional reform rather than dissipating into temporary protest. Sociologists studied the role of community memory in preserving attention long after headlines faded. Together, these disciplines approached the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado not as an isolated anomaly, but as a complex intersection of individual action and systemic response. Cultural memory also played its part in keeping the story alive. Documentaries produced in the late 21st century presented the investigation through restored footage and interactive archives, allowing viewers to trace the slow accumulation of clues that eventually dismantled the conspiracy. Writers and playwrights revisited the moral dilemmas faced by those entangled in the events, exploring how fear, ambition, and loyalty can blur the boundaries between complicity and survival. Through these artistic interpretations, the case expanded beyond legal documentation into the broader landscape of national storytelling. By the time the century mark approached, few people remained with personal memories of the economic crisis that framed the original corruption scandal. For younger generations, the instability of 2001 existed primarily in textbooks and digital reconstructions. Yet the lessons derived from that period continued to influence public expectations. Citizens assumed that government budgets should be transparent, that investigative journalism should operate without intimidation, and that whistleblowers deserve legal protection rather than suspicion. These assumptions, now embedded within civic culture, were direct descendants of reforms born from the confrontation with the conspiracy exposed decades earlier. International observers frequently cited Argentina's experience as an example of how societies can transform tragedy into long-term institutional resilience. Scholars compared it with nations where corruption scandals faded without producing meaningful reform. The contrast highlighted the significance of sustained public engagement. The arrests that once shocked the country could easily have marked the end of the story, a momentary reckoning followed by gradual forgetfulness. Instead, they became the beginning of a deeper transformation because citizens insisted that accountability must extend beyond individual punishment to structural change. In Caballito, Local schools incorporated visits to the site into civics lessons. Students gathered on the sidewalk while teachers explained how a single file of financial documents once threatened powerful interests and how the attempt to silence that threat ultimately exposed a wider network of corruption. The children listening to these stories had grown up in a world where transparency portals and independent oversight were ordinary features of governance. For them, the idea that documents could vanish and investigations could stall indefinitely seemed almost unreal. Yet the presence of the plaque reminded them that such realities once existed and could return if vigilance faded. Across the decades, Argentina's institutions had faced new challenges: technological disruptions, political polarization, economic fluctuations that tested the resilience of reforms. Each time, commentators invoked the memory of the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado as a benchmark against which contemporary responses could be measured. The narrative offered both warning and reassurance. It warned that secrecy can infiltrate even well-designed systems, but it reassured that determined inquiry can eventually dismantle the walls protecting it. The emotional core of the story never entirely disappeared. Though the nation remembered the case for its institutional consequences, it also remembered that those consequences began with an irreversible loss. A life dedicated to careful truth-telling ended abruptly in a kitchen filled with scattered papers. A family spent years confronting absence before the investigation finally revealed the forces responsible. That human dimension prevented the narrative from dissolving into abstract policy discussion. It grounded every reform, every lecture, every commemorative article in the simple fact that justice matters because people matter. As the 100th anniversary approached, Buenos Aires prepared a quiet series of public reflections rather than grand ceremonies. Libraries hosted discussions about the evolution of investigative journalism. Universities organized panels exploring the intersection between economic crises and ethical governance. Community groups in Caballito gathered to remember how their neighborhood once became the focal point of a national reckoning. These events shared a common theme: the understanding that memory is not merely about honoring the past, but about shaping the expectations of the future. In the end, the Buenos Aires 2001 cold case Aclarado endures because it embodies a paradox central to democratic societies. It began in darkness, with secrecy, fear, and violence attempting to bury uncomfortable truths. Yet from that darkness emerged a chain of events that strengthened the very principles those forces sought to suppress. The investigation proved that evidence, patiently preserved, can outlast intimidation. The reforms that followed demonstrated that institutions can evolve when citizens demand accountability. And the passage of a century revealed that stories of courage and consequence possess a durability that transcends the individuals who first lived them. So the quiet street in Caballito continues its ordinary rhythm: traffic moving, neighbors talking, children walking to school, unaware that beneath their footsteps lies the memory of a moment when truth nearly disappeared and then returned with greater force than anyone expected. The echo of that night has softened, but it has never vanished. It remains woven into the conscience of a city and the architecture of a nation. A reminder that even the coldest case can ignite a transformation, and that the pursuit of truth, once begun, can resonate across generations long after the headlines have faded into history.